Brave warriors! I have won great renown through leading men to victory. I see no reason to change the habits of a lifetime today. So be not backwards in your attacks. Carry the fight to the enemy. Give him not a moment's rest. Scream your defiance in his face. Stab him, kick him, bite him, cut out his liver, and...
Good morning, everybody. And let me just wait a few moments here while we allow a few more people to gather, and then we can start talking about the Valinor faction, which is, of course, what everyone is here for. We will have a brief discussion at the beginning, then we'll stream a few battle replays, so you can take a look at the current state of Silmarillion, and then we will be talking a little bit more about the Valinor faction, where I can hopefully answer a few more questions that you've had a chance to ruminate on throughout the course of the stream. Let me just see here. I'll leave prematurely, but I want to let you know that I love Silmarillion Total War and your way of presenting it. I'm excited for when they actually have campaigns for you to play. I'm also really excited about that. We can talk a bit about campaign today. It's more or less in the same state with the map having been created, but we do have a really strong direction for where we want to go with it. So if people have questions about that, I have no issues revealing quite a lot of details about campaign. Aside from a release date, please don't ask, because I can't answer that. And yeah, generally I don't give release dates for things. Alright, so we'll give it a few more minutes here, and then we can open the floor to some questions regarding Valinor. And in the meantime, we'll have some games going on in the background. As you can see, I've got quite a lot of them, and all of them, I'm pretty sure, come from the current build. So, you mad shame. This is one that we've done on the channel already, so I think that's probably a little bit more appropriate for the discussion, since it'll basically be going on in the background. Alright, let me pull up my notes here about Valinor. I have far too many notes spread across every device that I own. It's bordering on obsession, so I hope you guys are happy with this. In regards to Valinor, though, just a little bit of an aside, I can tell you that they will be getting some custom voice acting, and I've actually done a lot of the Vanyar lines, so those will be done by me. We'll be looking at maybe changing that up for other people, though. So I'd like to see us get some new people in to do a little bit more custom voice acting, so that the whole project comes together and feels really professional, because that's kind of what we're really going for. So I want to open the floor to questions for everybody, but briefly I will tell you kind of what I want Valinor to be and where I intend to go with the faction and all of the important salient details. A lot of this has been previewed on our Discord already, or on our ModDB, etc., etc. But I will go into it with you guys right now, and you can expect a lot more stuff. I'm going to be making some posters, I'm going to be doing a voice acting preview and that kind of thing in the future. But in brief, Valinor is a faction that I never really... Well, I kind of thought we would have eventually, but I want to play a little bit more with HP and really strong elite tiers. So moving into our later factions like Valinor and Nandon Gortha, we've had a lot of development time, and I've had a lot of time to kind of test concepts and see what works gameplay wise and what really doesn't. So with factions like Valinor and with Nandon Gortha, I am a little bit more willing to take risks and to kind of break hard rules that in the past were sort of gospel, not something that I was willing to really compromise that much on. But in essence, Valinor will be a cosmopolitan army composed of several different sub-factions, those being the Teleri, the Noldor, the Vanyar, and the Maiar, ultimately. And I will explain why I chose to do it this way, because people are going to have some questions, particularly as regards the Teleri, I imagine. Any idea when 1.9a for Reforged comes out? I honestly don't know, man. I'm not on the team anymore, and I am out of sync with their development process. I imagine it'll be out whenever they have enough time to work on it and refine it, but I honestly couldn't give you any indication whatsoever. Sin of the Dark Cloud is on the team, however, as is WK and Steward of Dale, who are all Reforged developers. So they would be a better person to pose that question to. But yes, I digress. So insofar as regards to the Teleri, well, we'll leave them for last, and we'll talk about the other sub-factions first, because I think it'll become a little bit more clear. So we have the Vanyar, which is I'm really excited to preview and to talk about, and we've already got some really good shots of them up on both my YouTube channel and basically everywhere else that is development related. The idea behind them is to be this sort of solid front line, but also be quite small in number. The Vanyar being the fair elves, they are the smallest of the elven kindreds. But one important aspect, and this is again coming back to rules that I was unwilling to break in the past, is that being in the Blessed Realm, being in Paradise, being this close to the powers of Middle Earth, does have an effect on sort of the physical prowess of the beings that live there. So early on in the Silmarillion, Feanor's Noldor come back and they're ambushed by the orcs at the Dagor Aglareb, the glorious battle or whatever it is. And despite being ambushed, taken completely at unawares and obviously outnumbered, they handily defeat the orcs. And there's a line in there about how the light of the Blessed Realm had not yet dimmed in their eyes. And it's sort of implied that this is how they're able to defeat the orcs so quickly despite being taken at complete disadvantage. So in order to represent this, we're going to do something fairly pedestrian, I think, in that we're just going to add some extra HP to units like the Vanyar and to units like the Noldor. Just one sec, my cat needs out. Sorry about that. Question, when will the campaigns get released? Oh, that comes back to deadlines, and I really can't give you release dates for things. The reason I do that is not because I like to, I'm not trying to cultivate an air of mystery or imitate Blizzard or something like that. It's because I don't want to put stress on my team. This is a fun hobby project, and it's not their job, and they have other things going on. But yes, where was I? So, in order to represent that sort of, that nourishing effect, I guess, that Valinor has on the inhabitants of the Blessed Realm, we're going to be giving things a little bit of extra hit points. So the Vanyar will generally be capped at 80, and they will be using spears for the most part, because while we don't know a whole lot about the Vanyar, we do know that they were, from some notes basically, that they were also referred to sometimes as spear elves. They did prefer the spear. In order to keep them strong and relevant, I would also like to give them the slashing damage type, so that they perform a little bit better than your other average spear unit does. And there'll be two different kinds of Vanyar, and they will have sort of different roles for each of them. So there will be the Peacekeepers, the one-handed shielded spearmen. They're going to be mostly medium armor, and they will have an Inspire attached to them. And the fact that units like the Vanyar inspire, and that the Maiar will also have some really powerful Inspire effects, is going to be important for Valinor as a whole. It's not just like we're just throwing that in there for fun. It is going to be pretty important. Just stating that they will. When? Oh, you want to know if the campaigns will be released? Question mark. Yes, the intention is that we have 2 campaigns ultimately. One of them will feature Valinor sort of centrally, and that'll be the War of Wrath campaign, and the other will be the Grand campaign. Now, in terms of order, it'll be the Grand campaign that comes out first. That's going to be the one that involves the most factions, and just has the bigger map, and basically includes all of Beleriand. A shot here at Gondolin, getting ready to take on some Angband orcs, and Doriath as well. This is a pretty bloody battle we did on stream. But the Grand campaign will feature the sort of largest breadth of the number of factions in the game, and that's what we're going to be working on predominantly, at least for the next patch. That's what we're trying to really knuckle down and get ready for you guys to be able to enjoy. After that, it'll likely be the War of Wrath campaign, and that will function pretty differently in that it will allow you to actually play as Valinor, because you won't be able to play as Valinor in the Grand campaign. They will be present as sort of an end game boss fight for when you're playing as the evil factions like Tolin Gauderhoth, Angband obviously, and maybe, depending on how we end up choosing to handle the Easterlings, maybe as Ulfang aligned Easterlings. That'll be something that you have to deal with, and they will show up quite late into the game. We're still deciding on like what are going to be the triggers for that. Ooh, that was a nice shot there from the Mangonel. Not that nice though. Didn't really hit anything. Yeah, so that really depends on a lot of things, but the Grand campaign is something that I think that we have a better handle on, whereas the War of Wrath, I have a very general idea of how I want that to play. I see where the Mangonel is frying people. But ultimately, you know, the details are going to change, so I won't give you anything today. Pardon me, I'm a little bit sick. Not COVID, I swear. I won't give you anything today that I think may be subject to change, and the Easterlings in particular, how they're going to work, is something that is very likely to change throughout the development process. So yeah, that would be the campaigns there. Hopefully that answers your question. We've talked a little bit about the Peacekeepers. Next we have the Plaza Guardians. They're the 2-handed variant. They're going to have slashing damage and armor piercing, so really they're going to be functionally a lot more like halberds than they are like 2-handed spears, but they will blend the utility of the 2-handed spears with the higher anti-cavalry bonuses and the extra melee defense for the survivability. But I really want to know, playing as Valinor and attacking Melkor's forces early game would be weird. Indeed, it would be weird. It's good that you can't play as them in this Grand campaign. Yeah, originally Valinor was just intended to be exactly that, just an endgame boss. Maybe they'd get, you know, a few core units, probably Vanyar, that were unique, and then we would just reskin for other units. But actually, that's not a bad segue into how Valinor would be handled in the War of Wrath campaign. So one of their sort of faction traits is that they will be able to draw upon other forces. So that has remained consistent. That was originally what they had were intended to be. But they've since grown. So at the moment, they've got, I think, with artillery and everything included, not including detachments, however, they've got about 18 units in total. And those are all unique Valinor units, with the exception of maybe like trebuchets and stuff, which are going to function, at least for now, will function more or less like normal trebuchets, although I would like to expand and diversify our artillery rosters just kind of across the whole game. Oh wow, fire raining down from the sky. Poor Gondolin over here. It's actually you, Mad Commander, who's getting pooped on. But yeah, so I'd like to maybe expand some of the artillery in the future. But at the moment, they've got about 18 or so units. In addition to, they will be able to recruit units from the House of Finarfin, the House of Fingolfin, the Hidden Realm of Gondolin, or the Hidden City of Gondolin, as well as the Folothrim. They will be able to use them in campaign. And those units that they can recruit will get Valinor-specific reskins, so they won't just be sort of tacked in there and look a little bit out of place. There will be thought basically poured into how I want them to look. So color-wise, I would expect the Noldor to resemble the Noldor from Valinor a little bit better, as they would be armed by them in this instance. So their color scheme will probably shift towards that, which is going to be like light blue, gold, white things like that. That's the direction we're going to go with for the Noldor in terms of color scheme at the moment. So you can expect the relevant Noldor units from other factions so they can recruit in the War of Wrath to look a little bit more like those Noldor from Finarfin. The Teleri and the Philothrim will probably look quite similar to one another. I'm thinking more of a light blue, a lot of light armor, and it just kind of makes sense that they would resemble one another. And then Gondolin, I'm not too sure what will happen with Gondolin. Gondolin might be a faction that actually just, sort of stays unique and weird, because they already have their own style, as you can see here. And they'll probably be the least recruitable, since many of the Gondolin, in fact, most of their military died at the fall of their city. So, yeah, there's going to be a lot of thought that goes into it. It's not just going to be like, here, have some extra rosters. No. The units will look different, and what we include and what we don't include will all be very deliberate and very thought out beforehand. So, yeah, that's a brief idea of how they'd work in the War of Wrath campaign. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. The War of Wrath is going to be one of those kind of stack spammy campaigns, which is something that we're trying to get away from in the Grand Campaign. So in addition to all the extra units and yada yada and a different campaign map, it will play a little bit differently. You'll be able to have these sort of grand, insane battles where you're grinding down stack after stack, because that's sort of what the War of Wrath should be. Whereas in the Grand Campaign, we want you to have to make some harder choices, limit recruitment a little bit more, have things more of a slower pace. Whereas the War of Wrath, I would really like that. I'm about to get caught out here if I'm not very careful. Yeah, it was a very, very near thing right there. I wish I could say that this was intentional bait, but it very much was not. Although we are able to kind of turn it to our advantage. Yeah, my poor sentries there get caught out. Very nearly routed. It'd be a bad thing. Very bad place for your sentries of Gelion to be. So yeah, so that's one of the key differences, is that the way the recruitment gets handled and the amount of armies you'll be able to field in the War of Wrath campaign with Valinor, etc., will be drastically different. But it'll still be, I'd like to think that it'll still be challenging. It'll come with its own sort of challenges, because the Valinor units will obviously be very powerful. But I would like to represent certain logistical realities, I guess, of fielding these very elite units very far from home, in that the recruitment for the Vanyon and the Noldor and the Teleri will be a little bit more limited, and you will be supplementing a lot more with, or rather the Vanyon and the Noldor at least will be limited. You will be supplementing a lot more with the mercenaries and the units from other factions, and the Teleri in particular. But yeah, so we have a third Vanyon unit to talk about today, and they're going to be, it's actually appropriate, we're zoomed in on cavalry here because it is in fact a cavalry unit. It is a 2 HP cavalry unit, and this is something that I've deliberately gone to very great lengths to limit in Silmarillion because of how powerful A, cavalry is in Medieval 2 generally, and B, previous experiences have shown that those units can very quickly get out of hand and become basically essential picks on the roster, and also a little bit, dare I say, overpowered. But before we get into that, let me just take a look here. I made it. What'd I miss? You missed a little bit of discussion regarding a couple of Valinor units, specifically their infantry for the Vanyar, and then some of the differences that you can expect to see between the Grand Campaign and the War of Wrath campaign. But yeah, so moving on to the next unit, we have the Hunters of Oromi, who is one of the Valar, and they're going to be a spear cavalry / lancer hybrid. Now, when it comes to cavalry, I'm very much aware of the fact that Valinor can actually field a good deal of mobility, and there is a good reason for that. But a lot of their mobility is going to be, pardon me, just a second here, need a drink. A lot of their mobility is going to be, fairly specialized. It's going to do certain things, so you're not always going to want to bring them. So that's one of the methods that I intend to use in order to prevent the situation that I just described to you, where these cavalry units with the HP, they're just so powerful and so dependable that there's really no reason that you would ever want to bring anything else. Like, you're always going to bring these kinds of units. So the Hunters of Oromi in particular, despite being Spear Cavalry, won't have any really high bonuses against specifically opponents riding horses. And we are able to differentiate with mount-specific bonuses between horses, quote-unquote camels, which are all wargs in our mod, and then elephants. So the Hunters of Oromi, Oromi being one of the huntsmen of the Valar, he would go out in the early days of Middle-earth and hunt down the beasts of Melkor. So this unit will be specifically tooled towards being very strong against elephants in particular, sort of middling bonuses against wargs, and then no particular bonuses against cavalry. Which means that because of how expensive they are and how low the model count is, oh no, there goes King Turgon, engulfed in a fiery inferno and slaughtered. Speaking of slaughtered, we're really giving the Doriath troops here a run for their money. So yeah, they'll be good at fighting elephants in particular, which is something that once we go through the entire roster of Valinor, you'll notice that they don't exactly have a lot of very direct counters to, but they do have a couple of interesting specialist units. One of them is a Mire Bodyguard, but in any case. So the Huntsmen of Oromi, or the Hunters of Oromi, will be good at hurting elephants. But they will also have an armor-piercing charge, so there is the possibility for them being used as like quick cycle charge lancers as well. I don't necessarily want things to just do one thing, but I want them to be very good at doing one thing, and then just sort of okay or mediocre at doing them in other areas. Or doing things in other areas. So that's basically it for the Vanyar. If you guys are interested in seeing models for them, we do have previews up basically everywhere at this point. So the Vanyar have been previewed, I think, up and down on Discord, ModDB, our Instagram. I've even got some pics up on my channel. But they are very fantastic looking, and in terms of an overall aesthetic, I'm treating the Vanyar as though they're sort of the face of Valinor. They're this sub-faction of elves that we know almost nothing about, and in terms of their role in, I guess, the pecking order of Middle-earth and what they spend most of their time doing, they are in a lot of ways analogous to the Christian, specifically Catholic, conception of Seraphim. So you're going to see a lot of like 6 wings, basically, on their armor and on the way they decorate themselves. And we're very much going for that heavenly host kind of vibe. And that's because the Vanyar, aside from appearances in the War of Wrath, they don't actually have any dialogue in any of the books, any of the stories. And they're actually written, when they are talked about, most of the time they're written in a passive voice. So it's like, the host of, the Vanyar or the West or whatever was led by, a Vanyar elf, Ingwion, or Ingwe in the beginning when they make the initial trip to Valinor. So it's an opportunity to expand upon these weird elves, and we're going very much for a heavenly host vibe, sort of the Avenging Angels thing. So if you look closely at the designs that we have put forward already, I think you're really going to see that. Yeah, and they look golden and glorious, and it's just fantastic. So moving on to the Noldor, the second sort of sub-faction. Now, the Noldor are going to act as the heavy infantry of Valinor. So the Vanyar were, pardon me, the Vanyar are medium tier. Or not medium tier, but rather medium armor. So they cap out at around 7 armor. Whereas the Noldor are going to have a base armor of 10. And they are also going to be a little bit smaller than the Vanyar. Because this is just... While the Vanyar are the smallest kindred of elves, the Noldor remaining in Valinor are just remnants, basically. They're the few people who repented of the kinslaying early on, repented of their rebellion against the Valar, and then went back under Finarfin, of House Finarfin, the brother of Fingolfin, and they stayed in Valinor. So they're going to be a little bit smaller. They're going to be capping out at about 60 men per unit, but they will have some higher caps than the Vanyar. So individually, the units will be smaller, but the caps will be higher. So if you so choose, you can actually field more Noldor than the Vanyar. Because I think it's fair to say that they're probably, even at their smallest, they are at least comparable or a little bit larger than the Vanyar. Because the Vanyar are just such a small kindred of elves. And there's going to be some interesting things that we do with them. So, pardon me. They're going to have a base morale of 18, which is pretty high. They've got 15% to all charge damage. They've also got increased charge distance. Again, Valinor is going to be a lot about their mobility. So cavalry and the light skirmishers and things like that. And the Noldor sort of play into that in that their charge bonus, or rather their charge distance is a little bit higher, so they can activate that and like get running and get that extra speed at a greater distance than other such units. They also upgrade their armor for a reduced cost of 40, whereas the Valinor would pay double that. They pay 80 to upgrade their armor from 7 to 9. The Noldor have a base armor generally of about 10, and they can upgrade that from 10 to 12 with the armor upgrades. And their base damage, not just +1 damage on whatever they do, but base, so the number that they start at is going to be +1. It'll be very damaging, whereas the Valinor are still a spear unit, so they've still got, you know, the lower base damage that spears and stuff tend to have, even though they do have the slashing damage. So the Noldor will be the truly damaging units, but they can also form sort of the meaty front line and support the Valinor. So the first unit that I want to talk about is the Hearthguard of Tyrion. Names are currently temporary. If you guys have better names, by all means, throw them at me, as long as it's not Swordsman of Tyrion or something like that. I'm trying to do things a little bit different. And the swordsmen are basically what you'd expect. Base armor of 10, 2 HP, capped at 5 in multiplayer, so you can field quite a lot of them. Next, we have the Sentinels of Tyrion, which are the two-handed swordsmen. Now, because they are small, they will have the Relentless trait. They've also got the base armor of 10, and they've got a 2 missile deflection bonus. So from the front, it is basically a passive invisible shield bonus to sort of simulate the crazy, I suppose, superhuman, otherworldly reflexes of the elves. So think Swordmasters of Hoeth, if you guys play Warhammer, if you need an analogy. And the Sentinels of Tyrion are a little bit interesting in that they will be the subject of the Legendary Company. So we will have the Sentinels of Tyrion, who are relentless, 2 HP, have the missile deflection, etc., etc. And then we have the Grieving Sons, who are going to be drawn instead from the Teleri. And they're going to be, in a lot of ways, the opposite of the Sentinels of Tyrion, but also it's a really cool opportunity to create a rivalry with an already existing Legendary Company. And that is going to be the Kinslayers of Alcolande. So the basic idea behind the Grieving Sons, although the backstory itself is being written by our community, we're having a competition. The basic idea is that they are the surviving children of elves who would have been slaughtered during the flight of the Noldor and the first kinslaying at Alcolande. So they're going to be a little lighter than the Sentinels of Tyrion, and they're going to not have the 2 HP, and I'll explain, why the Teleri don't have that a little bit later on when we talk about them. But they will have double the unit number, so they'll have 120 as opposed to the 60, and they're going to rely very heavily on their melee defense, but they're also going to get their base damage, again, different from just tacking damage on, increased by +2, and they will also be locked morale. So there is a choice there between the Sentinels of Tyrion, who have this, have heavier armor, they're relentless, whereas the Grieving Sons are not, and they have the extra, 2 HP, so there's some survivability things there, whereas the Grieving Sons will generally be much faster, and they will have higher melee defense, so there are certain things that maybe you want to use them for. The higher numbers and the higher melee defense in particular makes them really good chaff grinding units, whereas the Sentinels of Tyrion, maybe you want to throw them against some elite tier units, or you want to mix them in a line with the Teleri, to try and support them, because offensively the Teleri are a little bit lackluster. I shouldn't say lackluster. They do their job, but they're not really intended to be offensive units, but we'll get into that. So there are some choices there, as I like to have when I make the Legendary Companies. I don't want it to just be a black and white kind of thing. And then finally we have the Knights of Tidion, who in a lot of ways are the opposite of the Hunters of Oromi. Another 30 model cavalry unit with 2 HP. They, however, take penalties against elephants. They've got average bonuses against wargs, probably noticing that wargs can be particularly effective against these units, because that's one of the few things that a faction like, say, Tolin Gaurhoth has over Valinor, who would otherwise trounce them in every other aspect. So we're trying to build in these little niche things for other factions right from the get-go. It's like the core concept of Valinor to make them fit into the meta better. So they'll be lacking in bonuses against wargs in particular, but they will get a higher than average bonus against horsemen, the Knights of Tidion. And they will of course have an armor upgrade like the other Noldor, base armor of 10. You can upgrade that to 12 rather, with an armor upgrade. So hopefully things are starting to take shape here a little bit. So very strong core rosters here for the Valinor faction. But before we move into the Teleri, I'm going to talk a little bit about them and what they're going to be like. Let me take a look here at some of the chat and see if I've missed anything, or if there are any questions we can answer. How excited am I for Valinor? I'm super excited for Valinor. You may not be able to tell right now. I'm just generally at a low ebb because I'm not feeling super well, and I've had a pinched nerve in my back for the last little while. But very excited. Will the Teleri be an archer-only part of the Valinor faction? Not archer-only, but they will make up a lot of the skirmish potential, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. The new faction multiplayer or just campaign. So they will be available in the War of Wrath campaign. They will be present in the Grand Campaign as an AI-only faction, and you will be able to play them in multiplayer. So in some form, they will be represented in basically every aspect of Silmarillion Total War. So the answer is yes. Yes. Not very physically sturdy, judging from the kinslaying. Will Valinor have a lot of elephant-type units? No, they will not. Now, I'm considering adding eagles to Valinor. As a campaign-only thing, something that you would have to play against. And that is entirely contingent upon finding a way to make the Eagles, I guess, functional for the AI. Because currently, as I know the Eagles, and the source I would take them from is probably either Botet or from Reforged, who already has them like in-game. But they need to be cycle charged. From what I understand, they don't actually have like, attack animations, melee animations. So it would be, if I can, maybe sit down, and I'm doing game design, so I have the option to maybe make some animations for them once I start my 3D animation courses. So if I can make some animations for the Great Eagles, or find them, or have someone make them for me, then I'd be interested in including them. Probably in campaign only, but potentially in multiplayer, depending on how functional they actually are. But other than that, no, the intention is not for them to have a ton of elephant type units. I think that would be a lot to give them elephants with all of the really devastating heavy infantry and medium infantry and the other things that you're going to see once we finish talking about the Teleri. I think that would be a little bit too much, and the intention isn't for Valinor to be this overwhelming force, which may be disappointing for some people, as their conception of Valinor probably comes from the short passages about the War of Wrath and the Silmarillion. I do still want them to be, reasonably balanced. I want them to, pose a challenge, but still be overcomable. Not be insurmountable. That's the word I'm looking for. But in any case, this is not Valinor related, but will the evil orcish factions have some sort of scripted link to one another? Total War campaigns should be about choice, but I can hardly see them rebelling against Melkor. I think that's a really good question, actually. As regards the Grand Campaign, I think the intention is not necessarily to hard code them against each other, so it's like they can't unally at any point. But certainly we would want to give them some diplomatic relations so that they're less likely. But I do agree with that it is all about choice, and it's about, maybe flouting, history and canon a little bit, and we're more than willing to do that in the mod. However, in the War of Wrath, I would expect them to be hard-coded with one another, as that's just going to be about good versus evil, big battles, and just sort of this grindy warfare as you try to approach Angband, almost like a World War I-esque scenario for the Hammer of Wrath, or not the Hammer of Wrath, the War of Wrath. So yeah, I think you might see both. I think it's very likely that you'll see both, because I don't like the idea. Well, I do like the idea of having good versus evil in the Grand Campaign. However, I do think that there is something lost, something very valuable that's lost when you do that. So, we'll see. We'll see for sure. But yeah, just one sec here. I need a drink. My throat's starting to get at me. That's better. So let's move on now to the Teleri. Get over here to where the action is, making a little stand here over on the hill. This is a pretty brutal battle. Poor UMAD really got beat up hard in that early fight against Gondolin. We managed to beat Doriath, but the remnants have retreated behind Angband, and yeah, it's gonna be a nightmare. So we'll watch how that plays out. There we go. So let's talk about the Teleri. Now, because the Valinor units we previewed so far, and the Maya are yet to come, and they're particularly powerful with a lot of hit points, are so strong, it does need to be sort of balanced out by a real weakness. So the Teleri are sort of the softer underbelly of the Valinor faction, and that's not to say that they're just, you know, red shirts clad in blue. They do have some important roles, particularly as skirmishers. And it does, I think, add an interesting like skill cap and a micro tax, I guess, to playing as Valinor, in that you have these really strong units that you don't have to worry about as much, but they are surrounded by some squishier skirmishers and faster light infantry who are more vulnerable, so you do want to pay attention to them, plus your cavalry and things like that. So the Teleri are light infantry exclusively. They don't get armor upgrades, unlike the Valinor and the Noldor. And they're going to have some normal unit sizes. So whereas the Noldor, but at 60, the Valinor at 80, the Teleri are going to be more in line with what you've seen from the elves. So generally ranging from 120 to 140. And they're going to account for the entirety of the mid-tier roster. So everything else we've previewed so far has been high tier. And there are some important implications for that, especially as regards their combat stats, so melee defense and attack. So it'll be a little bit lower for the Teleri, especially from the unit size thing. But unlike a lot of infantry, has some particular implications for the infantry, most of them have the disciplined response to morale shocks, and it does prevent them from running at the drop of a hat. So, for example, Angband is a good sort of example to put forth as a faction that doesn't have those disciplined morale traits. So when their general goes down, or they get hit with shocks and fear and a whole bunch of things all at the same time, the Angband orcs are a little bit more likely to run. And that's going to be the case for the Teleri for sure. Not to the same extent as Angband, lesser than Angband, but it will be much easier to rout them than it is other elven units from other factions of their tier. So where the Noldor and the Valinor are the hard rock, the Teleri are the supporting sort of skirmisher militia almost, though not necessarily militia, it has connotations. But so you're going to see them get a lot of extra melee defense. Some of the units, including their spears, will get a bonus to their base melee defense, which is quite significant. And they're also going to be a little bit cheaper, because many of the units like the Valinor and the Noldor are going to be quite expensive. So you will be able to supplement the elite units with the Teleri at a very reasonable cost. So the first unit we have is the Mariners of Alcolande, because of course, the Teleri, very ship-focused. And these will be harassment javelins. They're going to be capped at 3. They'll have 120 men in their unit. And they're going to use the skirmisher template, so their morale is going to be a little bit lower. You probably don't want to get these guys charged by cavalry, for example, because they're not going to appreciate that very much. They will be armed with swords and some small shields. They'll have a base armor of 3, and they're going to get +1 to their ammunition. So they will be able to continuously fire their javelins and be more deadly in their given role as skirmishers than other units potentially can be from other factions. But of course it comes with the trade-offs of being relatively fragile and relatively easy to rout. Next we have the Marksman of Alcolande, and they're going to be your standard sort of light archer. They're going to get the additional ammunition that the Mariners are going to get too, but they're going to get +2. They will also be capped at 3, sword armed, but they will be unshielded. And they're going to have a base damage of 6, so a lot of, I think, human archers and mid-tier elven archers clock in at about 5. But the Teleri will be getting an extra point of damage, so you will be able to bring a decent amount of them at 3, and with 6 missile damage, you really can't go wrong with that. In Silmarillion Total War, for those of you out there who may be like, 6 is a little pathetic, there are other archers and other mods that have like 10. The way that Silmarillion has been balanced statistically, like from the ground up, this was a deliberate decision that was made, is that it's quite melee defense heavy, and it's quite low on armor, and shield values are a little bit middling on most units, and there's less heavy infantry to go around. So you don't actually need a really inflated value on your skirmishers, because everything else is balanced around enabling skirmish play or enabling positional play. So if you get behind people, get into their flank, etc., you're going to be ignoring a lot of their melee defense bonus, and things like that. And missiles ignore melee defense entirely, and that's the majority of defense points in the mod. So it may not seem like a ton, but it is actually quite significant. Next, we have Militia of Alcolande. There's going to be lighter spearmen, so they're going to have slightly better armor, and they'll have about 140 men in the unit. So instead of 3, they're going to have 5 armor, and instead of 120, they're going to have 140. Now, the 2 previous skirmishers that we talked about are going to have the low response to morale shocks. So you don't want to get them charged because they will flee, especially if unsupported. But luckily the Valinor are able to buff morale of nearby units, make that a little bit less likely when they are supported, but still, don't want that. Whereas the Militia of Alcolande are going to have just the normal response. So it's not super like a very elite unit response to morale shocks, mishaps, like a general dying, etc., but they will be able to stay in the fight better than the marksmen. So they're not all going to be on the same sort of tier there, and that makes sense because, I mean, if you have militia that have that low response and they just run away, they're not really able to do their job, and it makes sense that they would be trained a little bit better to endure the rigors of close combat. Yeah, speaking of being unable to endure the rigors of close combat, my poor army here is just routing like crazy. Huge swathe of my left wing just got crushed. Very unfortunate, whereas in the center we're holding up, I think, a little bit better. But moving on now, we come to one of the more unique units, the Slingers of Alcolande, because currently we only have one Slinger in the mod, and that's the House of the Tree for Gondolin. But they're going to be different, so they're going to be a scattershot Slinger. I'm going to think of a cute creative name for the sling itself, just to get a little bit of extra fluff. But currently, it's just a sling, just a light sling. And they're particularly good at dealing with large numbers of infantry. They do sacrifice ammunition, so it's a base ammunition of 10 for slingers. They're going to go down to 6, so -4 for their multi-shot projectile, which is pretty common. That's what we do with the multi-shot archers, the Marksman of Alcolande, for example. They're going to have 120 men in the unit, but they will use the infantry template, which means that their combat stats will be higher and their morale response and morale generally will be better, more in line with the Militia of Alcolande, the spearmen, rather than, say, the Mariners of Alcolande, the javelins. They will get some extra range, so that'll bring them from 110, I think, to 130, which is almost bow range. And they will have light armor of 3 and a shield value of 3 as well. However, they are going to sacrifice a little bit of the cost efficiency, so they will get plus 5% cost. So in total, they're only going to get the minus 5% to their cost instead of plus 10 that the other units that we've described so far will be getting. Next, we have another cavalry unit, and this is pretty important because I want Valinor. They have a lot of HP units, which can be very, very strong, very easily, get out of hand. I want them to have like a higher skill cap, so a lot of mobility, a lot of skirmish, a lot of things that you need to pay attention to, although those things probably won't be your heavy infantry because they'll be able to stand, on their own. So it's not like it's not like a city end where you have to make sure that, everything is in place at all times. But because there are some light units and a lot of cavalry, you are going to have to pay attention. And the Shoal Runners of Alcolande are a good example of that. So they are light, unshielded bow cavalry with excellent accuracy and damage. And that's something that I think you can say across the board for the Teleri, is that they will have very high accuracy, and their damage will be above average. However, the Shoal Runners are extremely fragile and quite prone to routing. I would say even more so than the Green Elf Cavalry, the Sentries of Gelion. We saw a little bit earlier. Hangman just overrunning our position here. Not a close game at all. That's alright. So, the Shoal Runners, 60 men per unit, and they will be capped at 4, and they will get plus 4 to their ammunition, which I think brings them to 36 in total, which makes them the horse archer with the highest ammunition count in the game. But they are very vulnerable, I would say even more so than the Green Elf archers. They're not going to get the range of the Green Elf archers as well, so there will be... That is something that I do keep in mind, is how they're going to fit into the meta, and what are the potential like rivalries or problems that could crop up with other factions. So the Green Elf Archers will outrange them. They will still have better accuracy, but the Shoal Runners will be more numerous. They'll be more vulnerable, and they won't have a very good morale response. So if they get caught, like my Sentries of Gelion did over here, they're going to be extremely likely to just run away. Whereas my sentries are a little bit made of a little bit more sterner stuff, and they're less likely to do that. So yeah, 4 of them. That's a lot that you can bring. You can bring a very strong skirmish corps with the Teleri, but you've also got a little bit of meat for the front line. The Spearmen in particular, I think, are a very important unit. The Militia of Alcolande, because they just give you the ability to move your important heavy hitting units elsewhere in a battle, while still being able to reasonably competently hold the line with some cost-effective spearmen, which I think is really important. Yep. Getting destroyed here. My poor Hondo. It's got some Gelion doing their best. And the Kinsmen have now come back, and we're going to throw them back into the fight pretty quick here. But yeah, so that is the Teleri roster. And then finally, we have the Maiar. But before we move on there, let me see if there's any questions in the chat. Valinor related. You can give them relationship boosts. Anything else needs to be in the script. Yeah, that I'm aware of. So that's probably something that we'll do for the evil factions in Grand Campaign. Give them those relationship boosts without actually removing the ability for them to completely go to war with one another, either as the AI or as the player, just so that you have that extra choice. That is a really good question, Calvin. Doesn't Valinor pose a little bit of a balancing challenge and a potential meta shift? Yes, they very much do, because as I mentioned, the 2 HP can be a little bit difficult to handle. A really good example of that is, I think it was the pre-.95, so it would have been like .92 or something on Reforged, when I was still really active and like playing the multiplayer. One of the things that I noticed is that if you couldn't grind down people's elite 2 HP units, or like 4, 5, sometimes 6 HP units, before the end of the game, and like if you ended up with mid-tiers that outnumbered them like 5, 6 to 1, you would still lose. Like it wasn't even worth playing it out to the end. So the issue with that is, making the units strong and worthwhile, but also expensive enough, and the Teleri, valuable enough that if you kill all of the Teleri and they still have their Noldor Vanguard core, then you're not just going to automatically lose the game. There needs to be a little bit of counterplay there. So a few ways that I'm going about addressing that is cost. So the HP units are quite expensive by nature, especially given the way that we use our price scheme. Like if I do have a spreadsheet, basically an Excel spreadsheet, that it automatically gives me the values that I need when I input stats into them. So it makes the whole process really streamlined and easy. And also very easy to adjust based on percentages, so I really like it. So that's one of the things we're going to do, is just make the Vanguard and the Noldor expensive enough that you do need to lean into the Teleri. Otherwise you're going to be fielding an army of like maybe 500, 600 guys, which will just get enveloped and destroyed by a faction like Angband. So that's one of the ways that we're going to keep them in check and keep people from fielding too many of them. But also by making the Teleri useful enough that you actually want to take them, but still vulnerable enough that they are sort of the weak link in the chain. So it's going to be a hard balance to strike there. And I generally shy away from things like 2 HP cavalry and an overabundance of 2 HP infantry or multiple HP infantry, because like I said, I've seen, the darker end of that, and it doesn't generally go places that I think are very interesting for gameplay and very good for a competitive multiplayer meta overall. So that is something that I will be monitoring extremely closely, like laser focused every step of the way. And yeah, I'm gonna be paying attention to that. I'm well aware that it can get out of hand, and steps are being taken, every step of the way, but also from the get-go, knowing what I'm going into and like knowing what I have to pay attention to. So I guess you'll just have to trust me and, refer to the work that we've done in Silmarillion so far with multiple HP units like elephants, Balrogs, etc., who are strong but still counterable. That's kind of what I'm going for with Valinor. So it does present a certain challenge. Anonymous replays. To me, the Teleri unit names seem very generic, including the Grieving Sons. All of these are just unit type of Alcolande. You know, that's fair enough, and I have tried to make them a little bit more straightforward, I guess. You know, militia, marksmen, slingers, mariners. All of these are very straightforward, and that's mostly because I want the Teleri to be, I don't know, I guess it seems appropriate to me because they are just sort of the meat of the army. Whereas if you go up to the Valinor or the Noldor, for example, you know, the Sentinels of Tyrion, the Hearthguard, Plaza Guardians, Peacekeepers, these are all a little bit more interesting, a little bit more unique, whereas the Teleri are going to be more simple in design, so their naming sort of does reflect that. As for the of Alcolande sort of tab, or tag, I guess, that's the way that I like to organize our rosters, right? So, generally, let's use our replay here is basically over. So let's talk about this with an actual real example here. So, let's use House Finarfin, because they have some very clear-cut distinctions between, you know, what is what. So the of Nargothrond units, those are from an important capital city. They're better armed, they're higher tier, they're just generally, quality-wise, a step above, say, units like the Stalkers of Tauren and Falroth, and Defenders of Talath Dirnin and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of things in the Talath Dirnin tier that we can see here, and then there's at least 2 things on the other one. So when you hear Talath Dirnin, you know, it's Swordsman of Talath Dirnin. You know that it's a mid-tier unit. Oops, sorry, that's my alarm to remind me to drink water. I'm going to do that. Just one moment. You know that, you know, Archers of Talath Dirnin, Defenders of Talath Dirnin, Stalkers of Tauren Falroth, Scouts of Tauren Falroth. You know that because it's of Tauren Falroth or of Talath Dirnin, that it's a mid-tier unit right away. And one of the important things for this patch in particular, and this is reflected in sort of our updated unit cards, is transparency. And that's reflected also in the way that the stats are sort of broke down here. So you can see what, at a glance, basically, what a unit's stats are, how they break down, therefore what they're good at, but also, you know, what unit or what weapons they're using in their unit cards, but you also know by their name what sort of tier that they are. So all of the of Alcolande units are going to be, you know, the mid-tier Teleri units. You're going to know that. You don't even have to hear the first part of it, really, to get a whole lot of information out of it. It's of Alcolande or Alcolande, and you know that it's Teleri, it's light, it's easy to route, or easier to route, and it's a little bit more numerous and probably skirmish related in some way. So that's the way that we do that. Whereas the Valimar units, so the Peacekeepers of Valimar or the Plaza Guardians of Valimar, you're going to know that they're Vanyar, they're elite, and eventually you're going to know exactly what they look like too. So they're going to be purple, gold, white, that sort of thing. So it's just a way of creating that sort of transparency and helping people get accustomed, like at a glance, you know, like when you're in a game and you look at something and you're like, you know, Defenders of Talath Dirnin, cool, I know exactly what that is. I know exactly what tier it is. I know what I have to do to deal with it. And it just allows you to make those quick snap decisions, where if we had, you know, a different name for everything, it does sort of slow that process down, especially for newer players. So that's why we break it down the way we do. And it also, you know, it ties things to geographical locations, cities, and so forth. That kind of draws you into the story of the mod and make things a little bit more cohesive in that way. One sec. Oh, had to clear my throat. Giancarlo is asking, so will the Teleri kind of steal the identity of the Mariner units of the Philothrum? Seems like they impose on their light infantry speciality. I personally don't think so, although, you know, it's helpful to hear those sorts of things because, you know, I look at things from a different perspective, I guess, than other people do. But at a glance, I could see them sort of, you know, pushing into each other's territory. And I think that's fairly natural in that they are both Teleran elves, right? And they both live on the shorelines. They're basically family from different sides of the pond. But I think the distinctions will be maintained in the sort of finer details, right? So the Falathrim are pretty battle-hardened. Their infantry is especially fast, although the Teleri will sort of share that as well. But they've got really good bonuses for their spear units, and more importantly, they have normal responses to morale. So while they are both light infantry, they're both quick. The Falathrim, I think, generally have better armor, better staying power, and they're just better suited at being infantry and better suited at combat than the Teleri. Because they don't have the same sort of roster, like, imbalance, I get. I don't know if I want to call it imbalance, but there's a certain asymmetricity to the Noldor and the Vanyar versus the Teleri, whereas in the Falathrim, that's not really the case. The Falathrim are a little bit more mid-tier focused and numbers focused, so their damage is spread out across their entire roster, and, you know, basic units like the Mariners of Brathambar are actually really valuable despite being, you know, mid-tier. They can do a lot of damage, and they can stand up to more punishment than the Teleri will. So I think that's going to be the big distinction, really, is just how the Teleri are more likely to crumble than the Falathrim, who are braver and a little bit more suited to the rigors of close combat. But yeah, so that's the Teleri. If anyone has any other questions about the Teleri or about what we've covered so far, just, like, pop it in the chat, and I'll address it after we talk about the Maiar today. So, that being said, let's get ourselves a little replay going here. We have a few that are just sort of like, they're fun, but they're not, like, necessarily super balanced. So I think I won't do that one. Do this one for now. So the Maiar. This is where we're going to look a little bit more at some specialization. So I want the super powerful units to be specialized. I don't want them to be generalists, because then you get into that sort of problem that I talked about earlier where, you know, just bring all your elite units and they're just generally useful when you just create like a Death Star. And that's what I'm trying to avoid is Death Starring. Because I think that it doesn't feel nice when you play against that and someone just like throws things in a pile and crushes you. And all of your choices are basically nullified by the fact that their quality is just insurmountable. And I don't think it's necessarily fun to play as, not in the long term anyway, and it's not really good for a competitive meta. Anyway, so the Maiar. The Maiar are going to enjoy an additional 10% on their melee defense and attack statistics, which will already be quite high because their unit, their model count in their units is quite small. And in Silmarillion, we do adjust melee defense and attack up and down based on the size of a unit using a little bit of math. They will also all benefit from the Relentless trait, so that their low numbers do not hold them back and make them obsolete, basically. So that's important. And I think that you can say individually on a per model basis, they are some of the best, if not the best, fighters to be found anywhere. And that's one of the, I think, key defining aspects of Valinor, aside from the really deliciously powerful core units of the Vanyar and the Noldor, is that their bodyguard units are probably the best in the game in terms of just raw statistics. But the first one I want to talk about is the Adepts of Tulkas. So many people have asked, are the Valar going to be present in the game? And while I can tell you that Morgoth will be in the campaign, he will be a general who you can't move outside of Angband, but if it's attacked, you can certainly use him, and he'll be fairly similar to Sauron, and I'm comfortable with that because we even have a letter from Tolkien himself who's like, long story short, Melkor at the end of the Silmarillion, when he's chained with Angainor, or whatever it is, and tossed through the doors of night, he's more or less on the same sort of power level, tier, I suppose, is a more modern analog for that, as Sauron at the end of the Second Age. when he's battling Gil-galad and Elendil. So when he's got the Ring of Power and he's at his greatest, that is more or less Melkor at the end of Silmarillion. So that, I think, is something that we can accurately represent in Silmarillion, and I think in Medieval 2 specifically, and I think that it would be a shame if we didn't have Melkor at all. He is the big bad after all. So I'm comfortable having him in the game, but other like full-fledged Valar who still have, you know, all of their spiritual power in themselves and haven't dispersed it throughout their creations and whatever, Monwe, Tulkas, etc. They're the sort of like god tier level that can like level mountains or raise mountains. They have some very, very crazy powers, and I don't think that we could do those units justice by just making them a glorified troll, or a troll with like a projectile or something, you know? I think that it would just end up feeling kind of cheap and gimmicky, and so I don't want to do that. I think that would devalue the mod as a whole if that's the best that we could do. And for the moment, I really think that is the best that we could do with beings of that sort of power. So they won't be present. However, in multiplayer, and especially in campaign, you are going to have units of Maiar that represent most, or maybe even all, of the Valar in some form. And so 2 of those for the multiplayer roster are going to be available, and we're going to talk about them right now. So the Adepts of Tulkas, one-handed macemen with some excellent shield values, but they are going to have medium armor, and that is to sort of balance out the fact that they will have 30 men per unit and 4 hit points. They'll be relentless. They're going to buff morale in a significant radius. They're going to be unbreakable, and they're also going to cause fear, and they'll have an additional 2 damage. And of course, being a mace unit, they're going to be armor piercing. So they've got a lot going for them. They are quite low in number, but they are super sturdy, especially from the front. Flanking them will obviously pay dividends, and attacking them from the rear is going to be really nice, especially with cavalry. You will be able to kill them off very, very quickly. And that is, again, very deliberate. So we don't have units with 6 HP, 30 armor that you just can't stop except with other units of their tier. So they will be very strong, especially if you can, like, if you mix them in with like some Vanyar or some Noldor, or if they're supporting like Teleri, where you'd expect normally if you were their opponent to be able to run over the Teleri, and suddenly you're like, everything is dying, I wonder why. Well, it's the Adepts of Tulkas. They just have a lot of like tactical flexibility. There's a lot of different ways that you can use them in a Valinor army, and they're very strong, but still, I think, a very reasonable implementation. And their special trait, each one of them will have something related to the Valar that is unique to them, and it's like a sort of special thing that they do. So theirs is the Fortitude of Tulkas, which gives them their +1 HP, which brings them up to 4. So normally the Maiar are going to have 3 HP per model, but they are, in this case, going to have 4 per model, because that's what the Adepts of Tulkas do well. Next we have the Heralds of Monwe, and these are going to be led by Eonwe. He will be, I think we're still trying to figure out the place of everything in this, but Eonwe will be present, and he will definitely be in the Heralds of Monwe. And I think that he's going to be an officer in it, and the overall general will be something else. But they're interesting. So one thing I forgot to mention about the Adepts of Tulkas is that they'll actually have a penalty against elephants, whereas the Heralds of Monwe are going to have damage penalties to like their base damage, which being a spear unit already is quite low, but they're going to have some serious bonuses against elephants, and they're going to be treated in an interesting way. So the more pedestrian stuff, +5 morale in a 50-meter radius, huge, very useful for a support bodyguard, especially as regards the Teleri. 40 men in the unit as opposed to the 30. They've got 3 HP. They are heavy, one-handed spearmen, and they're going to get +4 to 6. I haven't really decided, and we're going to figure that implementation out on our testing builds against elephants. They've also got 2 armor upgrade levels, a base armor value of between 9 to 10, depending on what ends up being more reasonable. They've got 3 HP. They do use the piercing damage, so they don't conflict too much with the Vanyar, who have slashing, which makes them a little bit better in close quarters. They're going to have a -3 damage penalty, and their special trait, and in order for this to make a little bit of sense, I'll just give you a brief blurb on the way that weight class is handled in Silmarillion. Light, medium, and heavy units all move at different speeds, with light units being extremely quick relative to heavy infantry on the lower end. And that is going to increase potentially a little bit in some of the upcoming patches, just to make that distinction a little bit more pointed and dramatic. So heavy infantry units can be quite slow, especially when in regards to elephants, who have high mass. They can push through people, knock things over, and they just generally move faster. So why that's important? The special trait for the Heralds of Monwe is Speed of the Eagle Lord, and they're going to use light infantry speed bonuses to maintain their uptime on large creatures. They will also be relentless, so it will not be as easy to stagger them or knock them over. So their role will be to find an important unit. Let's say Sauron, Melkor in campaign, which is quite appropriate, I think, for Eonwe being the representation or the emissaries of Monwe, who is Melkor's rival, and they're going to get on top of them, and they're going to just maintain that uptime, unless you can, throw something in front of them to try and stop them. And because they will have that higher speed, they will be able to disengage relatively easily, which is something of a pain in the butt when it comes to Medieval 2, because of the way that unit cohesion and AI pathfinding can be sometimes. But if you have a light unit that you can throw in some Teleri, for example, that'll allow the whole unit to disengage fairly smoothly, and then they can go about their business of hunting down elephants and things like that. So they won't be super great against infantry. That'll be something that the Adepts of Tulkas are a little bit more suited towards, but they will be extremely good at threatening large units, and there are going to be a lot more of those in multiplayer, with the addition of the Nandun Gortheb faction, which will rely very heavily on those units. So Nandun Gortheb will be very interesting, I think, in terms of a matchup between Valinor and Nandun Gortheb, in that Nandun Gortheb doesn't have a lot of quality, but their infantry units have a lot of staying power. And there's a lot of locked morale there, and there's a lot of big monstrous units that can deal damage in an area, and just generally be quite scary, especially to low model units like most of the strong units from Valar. But of course they don't have a lot of quality, so I think that that'll be a fun dynamic to explore once we have both of those factions on their feet. And then finally we have the third unit, which is sort of a middle road between the hyper specialization of the Adepts of Tulkas and the Heralds of Monwe, and these are actually not going to be Maiar at all. They will be some more Vanyar units. So you're going to have the Kinsmen of Ingwe. They are going to have +3 morale in a 30-meter radius, so it's sort of in between both of the other units in terms of the amount of morale bestowed and the radius that it's bestowed in. They'll be one-handed swordsmen, so a little bit more run-of-the-mill, and conceptually that's what this thing is. They will have 50 men in the unit. They will not be 3 HP. They will be 2 HP. So, yeah. They will also be sort of capped at 2. This is the budget option over the Maiar specialists, and this is to give you the option to go a little bit more of a cost-efficient route, especially in multiplayer in particular. In campaign, this will probably be used as a unique bodyguard for Ingweon, who will be the overall general model. But the Kinsmen of Ingwe, they are your budget option. So if you want to go, heavy into your Teleri and maybe lean a bit more into the Noldor, who are a little bit less expensive than the Vanyar, then that's going to be an option for you. So you're not going to be railroaded. And that's something that that's another challenge, returning to a question that Calvin asked earlier. That is another challenge with Valinor, where the sort of quality can go against them, is that if things are too expensive and caps are too tight, then you end up being railroaded in how you can play them in multiplayer. And I've seen that in previous iterations of Reforged in tournaments and tournaments that I've hosted, where some factions on the 0.92 patch or whatever it was, like the High Elves, were so expensive that there was really only 2 or 3 army clumps that they could bring, which, while powerful, made them extremely counterable, because you knew most of the time what they were going to bring, and you could effectively move to counter that. So that's something that I don't want any of our factions to experience in Silmarillion Total War multiplayer. Yeah, and especially the the Valinor faction, I think, would be particularly susceptible to that sort of weakness. So that's why the Kinsmen of Ingwe exist. That's why they're a little bit more just sort of like, they're there. They're a swordsman bodyguard. We have a million of these. Whereas the Adepts of Tulkas and I think the Heralds of Monwe are a little bit more interesting in their implementation. And that's just to give you more choices, and that's really important. That's a big focus of the latest patch that we just released, the Nirnaeth Arnoithiad patch. It's to give you lots of freedom, to increase the replayability, and yeah, just make things more fun and more interesting overall. So that's basically it for the Valinor faction. I mean, they'll have access to catapults, ballistae, trebuchets. What those end up looking like might end up being extremely different. Hold on, I think I'm in this game. Sorry about that. No, maybe I'm not. Maybe I am. I could swear that I'm in this game. Nope, I'm definitely not. In any case, so that's a look there at the Valinor faction. Let's get a nice shot of the battlefield here, see if we can see the whole thing. And let me see if I've missed any questions. Have I taken a look at the Troll Guard? No, I haven't. It's not really high on my priority list at the moment, just because, like, I've taken notes about what you want to do with the Troll Guard, Artorias, but because there's an RP going, and because I don't want to have all of our active testers, sequestered away from the rest of the community where they can, be helpful in getting games going, teaching new people the ropes, I'm not going to be doing anything specific, any testing, things like that, until much later when we're actually ready to have a test build. So, yeah. Speaking of Valinor in the campaign, will they be locked behind a base game Aztec-like script, which pretty much makes the AI go to sleep and only awaken if, say, all but one of the Elven factions are destroyed, if a selected amount of Elven capitals are taken? I hadn't specifically planned for it, but I think that's a really good idea, Vision, and that's something we could explore. Valinor, I would like it to maybe be present on the map, although maybe not, because I don't want people to sail there, and not having Valinor be available as a tile that you can take. One, saves us a tile that we can then use in Balerion to make the map more robust, and two, accurately represents the ban of the Valar on the races of Middle-earth. So I think what I would like to see is have them be a faction spawned by script, probably along the lines of what you have there. I think that's the best implementation. Will the unit models be similar to what you did with Sauron? Which unit models in particular are you referring to? If it's an elephant unit, like say Morgoth, for example, yes, he will function similarly to Sauron. There are some other interesting things that we could do, especially with an AI Morgoth, where they can, basically by deleting certain lines from a projectile's entry, you can make it invisible until, say, it explodes and breaks into a giant fireball. So basically, what it looks like is that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this fireball goes kaboom and sprays fire in an area. Following up from talking about animations earlier, one of the things that I want to do is create an animation for Sauron for the next patch and give him a projectile sort of along those lines. But I would like him to sort of raise his hand up as sort of a power thing, almost like DBZ-esque, where he just raises his hand up in the direction that he wants the projectile to go, and then boom, that's when the fire happens and things like that. So that's something that I'm looking into, playing a little bit more with animations, because that's what I want to focus on in school and is really important, really interesting, really compelling to me, and I think can do a lot for the mod, so it's easy to keep the motivation up. So I want to play with some new custom animations. In that vein of conversation, I will also say, because I was asked this question fairly recently, Glaurung will be a thing, and my intention is to use him as a school project for both my animation and for our 3D modeling. So I want to create from scratch on my own a really nice dragon model for Glaurung. I want to animate it, rig it, do all of that stuff, which would play into my education, doing my game design degree and things like that. And yeah, so that's something that we'll hopefully also see in the future, and, you know, the skills that I learned doing that will percolate down into things like Morgoth and Sauron, and making them more interesting. But at their base, I would say that it's a fair assumption to think that they'll work the way that our elephants currently do. Might be a little bit smoother, might be a little bit stronger, because there are some delays, like artificial delays between the animation sets that were done on purpose in order to limit the strength of those units, but I want to get rid of that. I want to make it a little bit smoother and then balance those units in other ways, because at the end of the day, what I want is for Silmarillion to be a polished, professional-looking project. Not just as a matter of pride, and because I think that the community that supports us deserves, you know, the best that we can deliver to them, but also because it is something that I do think about in terms of like a prototype for, you know, maybe a game that I want to create in the future. Because one of my personal ambitions is that after, you know, working in the industry for a while, hopefully the game design thing works out nicely, I would like to see about opening my own indie studio, and I would like to sort of play with RTS as a genre, because throughout my entire life, you know, RPGs come and go, and I do like RPGs, but RTS has always like grabbed my attention, and I think that there's a lot of cool things that you can do with RTS as a genre that makes it awesome, like in terms of creating replayability and like making interesting choices and like having compelling like challenges and like clever ways to overcome them with like tactics and composition, things like that. I need to take a quick pardon me, I need to take a quick drink here. I think it's my favorite genre, and I think it's one that you can have all of those things without having to, you know, script 10,000 dialogue options. I think you can achieve it just by giving people tools and then being like, have fun with them. So it's approachable from like a design perspective and like a financial perspective, but also it's just fun. So yeah, at the end of the day, I want Silmarillion to be polished, professional, and fun to play. Something that will kind of keep you busy the way that Third Age has like kept us busy with Medieval 2 for a really long time to come. That's the aspiration. Whether or not that actually happens, we'll see. Will there be alternative bodyguards, bodyguard units for the Valinor, like chariots and cavalry, etc.? It would be cool to give like, Ulmo a seahorse chariot vibe to echo his Poseidon-like roots. I think that's a really cool idea, and I am straight up gonna steal that. I'm gonna write that down right now, actually, and pop that into my. Giancarlo gave me the suggestion, but I really like that as an idea, and I'd like to see that implemented. So give me a second here. Not just because like it's a cool idea generally, but because I don't necessarily want all the Maiar to just be infantry, you know? So I think that's a really cool idea. So yeah, the answer to that is yes. Yes, there will. I think we'll probably see that specific thing, but I also want to look at ways to add Maiar that are interesting and not necessarily human-shaped. The Maiar are shapeshifters, right? They don't have any sort of physical form, and you know when they do, it's usually because they've done something horribly wrong, like Sauron or Melkor. So I would like to do some crazy looking things. So maybe we have, because we're going that sort of divine route with Valinor, maybe we're gonna start to like dip into some of the weirder like angels from like Christianity. There's like things that are wheels of fire, you know what I mean? So maybe we can have those chariots, but those chariots, you know, are the Maiar. Something like that, like, you know, go crazy, throw some stuff at the wall, and we'll see what sticks. So I want to experiment with some inhuman forms, and because we've got a lot of like humanoid things. So maybe that's what it'll end up looking like. I think that'd be really freaking cool. It obviously requires a little bit more work when you do that. Because you have to like have like animations in the models in order to support them. But yes, I could see something like that definitely happening. Maybe some like Ents or some like really weird, fierce looking Ents as a Maiar bodyguard for Yavanna, for example. Yeah, see, Vision and I are on the same page. but not just like a copy and paste of the Ents that we have now, but like something fearsome and frightening, the Wrath of God kind of stuff. And I think that Valinor is a really good opportunity to let our creativity run wild. So yeah, super excited about that. But I think we've basically covered, you know, the long and short of Valinor here. So I want to show you a few replays that we've done recently, because I haven't really had time to upload them separately, because I do need my computer a lot. One sec. Just got a quick phone call here. I will get back to that in a little bit. But yeah, I do want to show off some of our replays and some of the stuff that the community has been up to here. It's just a matter of finding the right ones that are a little bit more interesting. I think this Melkor's Altar one is actually pretty cool. And I can talk a little bit about the map and... Oops.
Units, await my orders.
Yes, so I remember being in this game, and this was... It's not necessarily the closest, although it is reasonably close. But it does leave a lot to talk about in terms of, like, map design. And I get the sense that people are interested in sort of the way that the sausage is made, I guess. By which I mean, you know, why we do the things that we do. And I think that that's something that people have really been enjoying and sort of jiving with. So the map, this one was actually made by me. So this is the Altar of Melkor. And the idea here, although I kind of screwed up with the placement of this hill, is to create some like important features in the middle of the map in order to draw players in. Because one of the things that I've noticed is that if you just stick stuff out in the peripheries or like behind in here, depending on what you have, either they ignore them completely or they always, you know, pop themselves down on them because, you know, you put a big hill there and then it just becomes a camp fest. Nobody really likes that. So the intention here is to draw people in, but also to create some terrain-based obstacles. So we've got a lot of mud and stuff like that here, and hills and buildings that sort of break up the silhouette. And this is because in the new patch, light infantry, like the distinctions between light, medium, and heavy infantry in terms of their speed, have gone up markedly. So light infantry are quite quick, and oftentimes it's quite hard to use them in like a straight up field battle, like as an advanced like skirmishing or screening force, because people will just run them down with cavalry. The mud slows things down significantly, especially against factions like, say, Feanor, or anybody that has like heavy cavalry. Let's go ahead and slow things down here just a little bit, not that much. So the mud is going to slow them down, and will actually allow units like, say, the Philothrim here, who have Spearhost of Berthalmbar, Seafarers, etc., to maneuver very easily within this area, and even outpace them for just long enough that support can come in and help them. So that's a really important part of the way that this map was designed, just to make things a little bit more interesting in terms of how you play them, and just not have it be, you know, either camping or whatever. But there are some interesting things here as well that prevent it from just being the same old, you know, put your armies in a line really close to the front of your deployment zone, and then you move in for an infantry clash. So I've actually split my forces here. So I'm playing as the House of Finarfin. I've got a lot of my heavier troops here, things that I think will be able to stand up quite nicely to Tolin Gaurhas fire units, like the Mangonel here. One of them just got dumpstered, I think, by a trebuchet, which is really funny. Not something that happens very often. But it got dumpstered by that trebuchet, but the Mangonel is generally very good against tight clumps of light or medium infantry, especially if it can fire a little bit more indirectly. So I'm going to look at this here. And it's going to hurt. These guys are unshielded, but, you know, it's not the end of the world. So we lost like maybe 10 or 12 models here, whereas, you know, that has the potential to fry as many units as you put into this area. So I've put my heavier units over here. Things are a little bit better able to stand up to that. I'm going to occupy the important parts of this little minor settlement here, lock it off, and then I've got a significant flanking force over here as well. And I know that if I can get in there quickly, I can generally overwhelm Tolan Gaudhoth in close quarters with just my sheer quality, because their infantry is not super amazing, but they do have some tricks up their sleeve in the form of course, their cavalry and Tolan Gaudhoth, but also units like the trappers can be very, very deadly, very cost efficient against the elves, and kind of force you to fight a battle of attrition that you're just really not prepared to win. Scar-High Blunt-Triggers are another such unit because they have such high armor-piercing charge values, so if they manage to like get in behind or something, a unit, you know, they can kill 30-40 men in a charge, and then it's pretty bad news for you. So yeah, gonna try and keep them in front of me, move in with my flanking forces here, and then when the time is right, we're gonna begin to move forward. And apparently the time is right. So I got the Sartor Findorado here, a lot of my heavy shielded spearmen, my bodyguard, etc., to keep everybody in line. And we're gonna push against Tolan Gaudhoth as best as we are able. So he's kind of split things up here as well. Stewie's got his light infantry and other such things on the front. He's going to move some trappers over here because he's going to try and focus fire down some of my units. As I said, they can be very, very scary, even against some shielded units like this, but the Wardens, I think, are all upgraded. They have their shield from the front, so they'll be kind of okay. But I don't want to overextend by having them move any farther forward than what they are right now. Ash Priests are here as well, and they're the ones who are fricasseeing my Wardens in their armor. We've got that sling animation right there. It's going to hurt. Kick up that smoke and stuff. Sartor are going to be able to weather that storm a little bit better. Move forward here with my Wardens, crashing into his line as well with my Company of Prince Gwindor, who are unbreakable. Warband here. I believe I was able to use my ammunition on all of my swordsmen, so the Warband are just going to get absolutely dumpstered. A nice rear charge here against the Company of Prince Gwindor is going to turn a winning fight into a losing one here for me, as many of the company, about 30 of them, are going to die in very quick succession. So exactly that thing in practice with the Scar High. If they can get in behind you, they can be very, very effective indeed. So it's a fun little engagement here, because we're both factions that rely on like efficiency and like numbers and things like that. So it's just trying to see who's gonna come out on top, who can out efficient the other person. I've managed to also drive his cavalry into a corner, which is a big thing. So if they were like in the back here constantly pressuring me, then that would be really bad. Swordsman of Tyrion here, winding up, and they're going to toss at the Blood Drinkers, and they're going to turn that fight around and turn it back into my favor. Over here, I think things are going pretty well. I've managed to get into his trappers, who I think have used all their ammunition. Ash Priest pushing in these trappers here, kind of stuck in the mud, so my heavy infantry will be able to end up catching them. Bridge Wards of Nargothrond over here dealing with Eject Scouters Chosen. And then over here, I left some reserve forces. Not very many, it's more of a skeleton crew, along with my archers and a small unit of infantry here. The Hishbo Howlers are trying to force their way through, but even a small detachment of Swordsman of Tyrion is going to have a great time dealing with them. Hishbo Hunters moving over this direction. It's got some Eglarest here from the Dog Eater. I can't remember, I think he's one of the newer players though. Dealing with the Spearmen of the Swallow, a nice shot here from the front. Yeah, they managed to do pretty well. Laugskaraz, some cavalry supporting, from Tolan Gaudhoth, supporting his ally here. It's the city of Gondolin. Rex is standing his ground, however. The Laugskaraz weren't really able to get that charge off. And they're more about, rear charging, like getting that AP going. But their base damage isn't super, super high. But they also do trade decently with cavalry. But in a frontal charge like this, they're not really going to do all of that great, especially, unsupported behind enemy lines. So a rear charge here, I think, is probably the way to go. And the Philothrim, the Arankirlim, all kinds of things here, clashing with the Gondolin from the front. With the Mariners of Arendil in there as well. There goes my general. Bad news bears, Sartor Findorado, falling at the hands of the Lishbukraz Ash Priests. Over here, it's not going so well for Gondolin. Philothrim are able to sort of push through, but yeah, it really just extends all the way across the field here. Nobles of Baelor moving in, some more on Kirlim moving in to try and keep the pressure up on this left wing. I don't think there's any Gondolin cavalry in the area, and the Philothrim have managed to get some scouts and stuff behind the lines, so that's, not great. 2 Mangonels here. I didn't realize he had as many as 2 Mangonels, but he hasn't been able to get a lot of value out of them because I moved in here and used these buildings basically as cover, and I used the troops that were best able to stand up to this. My Archers of Taladyrnan, however, are not having a good time, getting focused down by these Scouts of Eglarest. My swordsmen are now going to rout almost immediately, having put up a very, very valiant struggle against both Warband and Howlers here, but they will be sent running for the hills. My Archers of Tyrion over on this side being preyed upon by some of the Laugskaras who are marauding about. But on the front line, we're doing pretty well. We're overwhelming him here. I've managed to get some of my Defenders of Tyrion in behind his lines. We're going to be able to just pick on basically anything. Now, these are Hunter Javelins, so they're generally better suited for dealing with, you know, hard targets, elephants, and the like. But he doesn't have Sauron, which is... Actually, I think he might have a Sauron in here somewhere. But I'm not really able to sink my claws into him, so I might as well use him or lose him, basically. And then I can use them as spearmen to try and, you know, block the cavalry that's over here, which is exactly what we're trying to do. Vorback Gajutar on the field. This is the legendary company for Tolkien Gaurhoth. They are locked morale, non-AP, but a little bit quicker and stealthier versions of the Laugskaras. These swordsmen here. I'm going to turn around to the last moment, countercharge. This is actually a little bit of bait here. Try and pull him in. At the same time, we're going to basically envelop him with a unit of Wardens of Nargothrond front. And try and kill off as much of the Vorback Gajutar as we possibly can. Stewart is going to see it. He's going to have to retreat through my spearmen, and probably due to the way the charge animations work, I don't think any of these guys actually connected. So I don't think he'll really lose any of the Vorback Gajutar in that exchange, which is a little bit unfortunate. Undone by Medieval 2 mechanics. Sad face. Yeah, they're just still charging and not actually dealing any damage. That kind of sucks. But we are going to drive them back again. Scouts of Eglarest now over here, preying upon our units. We've, you know, our micro was decent enough in this game. So Wardens of Nargothrond are here, Swordsmen of Tyrion are here, and we're going to go for another one of those envelopments. And against the Scouts of Eglarest here, who are already shaken, you know, it might actually work out pretty nicely. Stuart Dale, however, has something to say about that, coming in with the Hishpokraz Howlers. We've got some Hishpokraz Hunters on the other side, trying to rout off my troops here, and it's actually going to be successful. I think I can see some of them fleeing for the hills. Swordsmen of Tyrion valiantly holding the line, and while the Tolkien Gaurhoth forces move for an encirclement here. But you know, we're holding our own. Things are looking a little bit grim, but we've still got good numbers. We've got, you know, enough to keep the Vorback Gajutar and the rest of these things at bay. The Laugskaras have basically been destroyed at the cost of my Archers of Tyrion over here. And I believe that I still have another unit, so they've managed to survive, you know, being preyed upon by two different factions, Cavalry, and they're still kicking, and they've still got some ammunition. I am, however, going to move them in here against Hishpokraz Hunters, because they are very efficient at range. So if they were to turn around and start shooting at me, then I would probably lose that range duel just through sheer numbers alone, and the fact that the Archers of Tyrion don't have the greatest armor value. But I can beat them in melee, so I'm going to throw them in there, cut them down, and stop them from continuing to fire at our troops. Swordsman here nearly being routed. Vorback Gajutar still at full health, much to my chagrin. But otherwise, you know, he is coming in here with some reinforcements, but this, with the numbers that I have here, this is a fight that's going to go to me. Would have been a bit smoother for Stewart of Dale, I think, if he was able to concentrate all of his cavalry against me, but he was trying to help out his ally, quite wisely, who was struggling against Gondolin and their really strong defensive position. So, Orc Mangonel crew here, just tying down Spearman of the Swallow, Vorback Gajutar being brought in for probably some nice hammer and anvil attacks. Well, I think they're going to stop by and say hello to my Archers of Tyrion beforehand. Meanwhile, over here, both Gondolin and the Philotheron basically ground themselves to a halt. Scouts of the Tree able to kind of overwhelm the Marksmen of Balar, who rely heavily on their armor and don't have the greatest melee defense, so the maces here are actually going to be pretty nice against them. More Scouts in the Tree being held up there in reserve. I think the Philotheron are going to be able to, if they move in here and start to surround, then they'll be able to kind of fight their way through that. Over here, Shield Bearers, there's 39 of them. I would not say that they're going to win that, despite what the game is telling you. Over in the center, the Arain Ephedun, the bodyguard of Círdan himself. I really like this model. Shielding's a little bit of work, though. They are instrumental in defeating what remains of the Gondolin mid-tiers here. Marksman of Balar, very much victorious against the Guardsmen of the Harp. Over here, though, things have gotten a little bit better for Gondolin. So the Nobles of Balar and everything else that was sent over here in reserve. Imagine there's some dead Arain Ephedun all over the ground, as well as some macemen. Orion Efadun, rather the Aran Kirlim, and the Champions of the Fountain are probably instrumental in that. Very, very strong unit. Yeah, there's the Aran Kirlim putting up a great fight here, along with the Nobles. But this is going to go to Gondolin. But basically everywhere else, it's sort of in the balance, or the Philothrum have a good chance of winning it. Down here in Scouts of the Tree, however, something to say about that. They've come in from behind, and they're beginning to encircle these Philothrum here. These marksmen are still losing to the Scouts of the Tree. And over here, the Orc Mangonel crew, unsupported by Stuart of Dale's cavalry, who are unfortunately very, very preoccupied with dealing with my Archers of Taliesin. I personally would have been like, yeah, you know, screw it, and then tried to go over here and win the game for my ally, because there's really no way that he can beat me with what he's got here. Yeah, it's just sort of playing for time maybe and trying to keep me from getting into his ally, but I personally think it would have been a better use of his time to take the war back and get out of there. Haul ass, as it were, and then try and smash into those spearmen. But yeah, so we're scattering the rest of the Tullingauerhath forces. There are some spearmen here that have come back from routing. Stuart Dale's going to throw them back in, but we'll be able to handily see them off. Some hunters have come back from routing. They still have ammunition. So there's, yeah, I mean, we've won this, but it's just a matter of like dealing with everyone else here. Wardens of Nargoth Rons are going to be completely nonplussed, taking the Hishbukaz volleys to the face, along with the company of Prince Gwyndor, who cause fear. They're going to get into those Hishbukaz hunters, and that'll basically be all she wrote. So I think the thing to do here would be to maybe try and run away, but there's only so much that can be done. Archers of Taliesin firing into them from the rear, fear-causing units, and adept melee troops crashing into them from the front. The Hishbukaz hunters are not going to be too long for this world. Meanwhile, things haven't changed too much. Gondolin is definitively winning over on this side, but it is still reasonably close at 74 to 89. And there are still a strong Philothrum presence, just as I thought they would. The Spearmen of the Tower, Shield Bearers of the Tower, rather, are being beaten back here by the Light Infantry. Orion Efadun still kicking. They are, of course, going to have their work cut out for them, but the Gondolin are not really all that numerous over here. The only things that are genuinely scary, I think, are the Champions of the Fountain. The Scouts of the Tree are alright, but the Spearmen of the Swell are really just there to act as red shirts and die for the cause. Now, some Guardsmen of the Harp here, just kind of sitting around and chilling. They're about to be swept aside by the Orion Efadun. We're going to go ahead here and kick it up into full speed. Gondolin now maneuvering everything that they have over to crush what remains of the Philothrum. Vorbat Gajutar charging into the Spearmen of the Swallow. They're going to do decent enough, but this is, I think, too little too late. There was a great opportunity here for some hammer and anvil strikes, or to get a little bit more value, at least out of the artillerymen, by forcing the Spearmen of the Swallow to turn around and pull out of that engagement earlier on in the match. But now the Vorbat Gajutar are here, and they're not really capable of being decisive. They're just capable of being a nuisance, whereas previously I think that would not have been the case. But really nice opportunity here to charge into some of the rear of these units, especially the scouts. Oh, it's gonna hurt. Yeah, let's see the casualties begin to mount there. He doesn't want to stay in there for too long because of the Trebuchet crew being a halberd unit, but it was pretty brutal. I think these guys were at like 60 or something and nearly killed off about 20 or so models in charge. And I think the main concern is going to be the Champions of the Fountain for Stuart of Dale. It's really hard to say at this point. It doesn't really matter too much what he's going to do. Oh! Rex doesn't see it, though, and that's where it can be really devastating. Spearmen of the Swallow, Champions of the Fountain, very nearly routed there. Just a moment, I just need a quick drink of water. There we go. Vorbat Gajutar going for another charge here. It doesn't look like Rex is going to see it, which is surprising. But at the last moment, Stuart Dale is actually going to pull out of there. I think maybe expecting some retaliation. But if he's able to just continuously do this, he'll be able to rout off a significant number of the Gondolin troops. So maybe I was wrong about them being able to be decisive. Some Scouts of the Tree and some other things over here. I can't remember what happened. Maybe this is like a game that Rex suddenly had to leave in and just didn't tell me. The Orion Efadun holding the line here. providing a very nice anvil to the hammer of the Warback Gajutar. And they're just running around, just being a nightmare. These poor scouts there, gonna get run down. But it really doesn't matter all that much. There's not anything else that they can throw in front of me, stop me from coming in and finishing the fight here. And these 2 units alone are not going to be enough, even if they manage to kill all of Gondolin by some miracle. They're just not going to be enough to deal with everything that I have left. Our defeat of Tolan Gaudhath was enough to be like decisive and relatively low cost for us. So moving into this, it's basically game over. I'm taking my time, however, not taking any chances. Got some Defenders of Tyrion here. Can move them forward to try and screen things out. And I also have my Archers of Tyrion who are going to be focusing on picking away at the Vorback Gajutar. So if you have noticed, their numbers have been steadily falling, and that is largely due to the presence of my archers. So it looks like Stuart Dale might be going for a bit of a charge here. But he's going to rethink that once my Wardens of Nargothrond arrive on scene into the Swordsman of Tyrion, and they'll deal okay. There's enough melee defense on the Swordsman to, be alright. But that delay and the presence of the mud is going to slow these guys down long enough. And my archers will be able to just continuously pick at them. Ooh, nice charge here. Maybe we'll see them round off. It's possible. I'm trying to get forward here. Yeah, I think maybe Rex had to go AFK or something because there's a big blob of Gondolin troops here. But ultimately, it comes down to about 81 to 97, so not necessarily the closest game, but still relatively close and a good example of the sort of things that you can expect to see on this map, I think, and some of the tactics that can be viable. Because we didn't sit back. We were definitely aggressive in this game, and aggressive as Finarfin, no less, who are one of the more sort of defensively minded factions, and at least can certainly do well in that kind of capacity. So it's nice to be able to play them a little bit differently here. Warback Gajutar down to 5, still trying to kill them off. And most of these Gondolin units now are beginning to run. The Orion Ephadun are not going to be able to enjoy their victory for very long, as they get enveloped and nearly instantly routed by the arrival of yet more enemy troops. Warback Gajutar finally been brought to bear. And, yeah, they're going to fall apart pretty quickly here.
The battle is very much in our favor. Victory will be ours.
99 to 82. It's not quite in that golden 10%, but it's a fun game nonetheless. And I'm going to have at least one more, definitely just one more, be able to show you here.
We are victorious. Our soldiers have fought and died well today.
And there we go. The admit defeat. And that is basically GG. So, let's take a quick look here at the way that things break down. Company of Prince Gwyndor did really well, despite being in the thick of it the whole time. And I think that really comes down to the fact that you just can't rout them off. Sartor did alright, but we were also playing against Tolan Gaudhath, so it's just a lot of like trashy kind of chaff infantry. I think against Noldor or like Sindar or something, this would have been about less than half of what we have here. Some of my swordsmen did really well thanks to those missiles, kind of padding their kill count a little bit. Wardens, everything did relatively well. Yeah, can't complain about that. So let's take a short break there and see if we have any additional questions, or I don't know. Do you like what you see so far of the mod? Do you have any more questions about Valinor? Really just, fire it out there. In the meantime, I'll load up another replay. Turn up our music just a little bit. Oops. I think we have some pretty interesting fights in here as well. Now, if I recall, the Woods of Brethil is a pretty fun one. So let's do that. And then we'll wind it down for the day, I think.
Units, await my orders.
Ah. So we have Stewie playing as the Haloden here. I remember this game. I don't think that I'm personally present in this game, but I know that it is extremely close. And it does give us an opportunity to look at some of the new Haloden stuff too, so why don't we go ahead and do that. So, new model here for the Dour Warda. This is actually their armor upgrade, and this was given to us by Reaper of the Conflicts of Eriador team, so a big thank you to him. And the same holds true for the general here. So the Haloden now finally have their own unique-looking general, and again, that comes from Conflicts of Eriador and Reaper specifically. But let's go over some army comps. We'll do them in order. So this one was pretty nice because we had some new players in the game. So Peyo, or Peugeot, I don't know how he wants to pronounce that. He's going to be playing as the Realm of Angband. He's got some Arbalists here, Crossbowmen, some Uruloki, a fearsome Uruloki. Some Spear Guard, and some Halberdiers are going to be making up his main line, which is a pretty formidable phalanx indeed. I think he might even have... No, I think he's just spread his Spear Guard out across that entire line. So solid front line. Got some Thralls of Angband here, which, given the person he's going to be playing against, that's going to be the House of Feanor. Probably not a lot that you can get done with them unless you're firing at the Edain. I got some Bulldogs of Angband here as well. The Dark Maiar, who are the probably the best bodyguard pick, I would say, for the Realm of Angband. And the model is just crazy good. We can thank Castellan of Angmar for that, who's recently released his own submod for DAC. So I recommend you guys check that out. Really high quality work in there. Tormentors of the Iron Crown, you're going to see them on the field today as well. These are heavy macemen. Trade relatively nicely with heavy infantry, of course, but especially with the Feanor infantry, as they are a little bit lighter on the melee defense side of things, and heavier on armor, which is what the AP stat is a direct counter to. We got two of those Tormentors. We also have some Troll Guard on the field as well. I don't think we have any of the legendary companies or the Balrogs. Nope, totally wrong. We have the new Balrog unit here now. This is based on the Botet Bloodthirster, but a lot of work was put into it by Skyly, especially in terms of the armor and the weapons and stuff. I think they turned out pretty nicely. So they do have some sort of random things that you can get, and occasionally you're going to get this, which is meant to represent Gothmog, the Black Captain of Angband. So occasionally you're going to roll that. Sometimes you'll roll more than one Gothmog, but currently we don't have a means of putting just Gothmog on its own into the game, so you will get references to him basically, and that's what this is. So Balrog are on the field today. Really nicely balanced Angband force. What am I talking about? There is a legendary company here as well. Scourges of Gothmog. Think of them as the lighter, non-armor piercing counterparts to the Tormentors of the Iron Crown. They focus a little bit more on their melee defense, and they do eschew armor and shield as a result. So, pardon me, even like a mid-tier archer firing freely into these guys can destroy them, and they are extremely expensive as well, clocking in, I think, around 1050 or like 1100 or something like that. They do also cost fear, so there's good reasons to bring them. And because of their high defense and massive charge bonus and damage, they can actually go toe-to-toe with Elven Infantry, which is something that basically every Orc Infantry out there cannot do very well without having a really high armor value. That being said, they do have some pretty serious weaknesses. So if they get shot to death, they can just be swept from the field by Rangers or decent bow cavalry or just any sort of focus fire, really. So you want to be careful with how you use them, so putting them back in the third line like this, probably the way to go. Moving on now to the Haloden, we have the House of Haleth being commanded by Stewie. He's got some well-tried Dragoons here. Sort of they are melee cavalry, but they do have some limited ammunition with their bow. I think they've got about 10 ammo, which puts them, just to put it in perspective, most bow cavalry have about 30. So these guys have only 10. They'll run out pretty quickly, so choose your targets wisely. But after that, they are really good, like light or medium melee cavalry. Over here, we have some dismounted versions of them, and they've got a little bit more ammunition, and they can hide. Actually, I think both units hide everywhere. But, yeah, the Haloden don't really have any dedicated bow units, but these guys can help supplement your skirmishing line, your long-range skirmishing line, if you so choose. Next, we have the Ulfinin, who have changed a little bit. They've gone from 100 men in the unit to 120. They've also lost their fear in order to avoid them double dipping into morale penalties and causing mass routes too easily. But they are still very strong. Relentless, high mass, they will push into things and butcher them. They also have 2 HP, and they have a passive missile bonus from the front, just to represent the fact that they are badass bear dudes who don't wear shirts when they go out to fight. So, yeah. Huskarlar are here as well. Some strong medium infantry, really high base damage, and some good charge values, and they also have throwing axes. But in addition to all of that, they use the infantry template, so they are competent warriors in close quarters. That being said, they don't have the greatest armor relative to, say, the Swear to Brother, who are a little bit more sturdier in that regard, and they don't have amazing melee defense. So cavalry charges, especially from lancers, who got a little bit extra charge damage, can really be scary against the Huskarlar. That being said, they're great chaff grinders, something you want to use against like lighter troops. Rigswear Brethil here. This entire line is basically just like locked morale troops. They do have some non-armor piercing javelins that do about 8 damage, so it's not too terrible. They also have a good charge value, but my favorite use for them, and I think Stewie definitely shares this philosophy, is using them as a hidden front line. So you're going to have these guys here. Got 2 Dour Warda on the field. Oh, no, we got 3 Dour Warda hidden behind the Rigswear Brethil here. So this is a lot of javelin power and a lot of like DPS and some locked morale chaff here as well to let the Dour Warda do their job for longer. And then up here we have another unit of Ulfodin, some dismounted Mardrot, some more dismounted Welsh Riders, and then some Warda of Brethil. And this is looking like a flanking force here that's probably going to be used fairly proactively, I would think, most likely in support of their ally. Next we have Martin, who's going to be playing as Doriath. Another one of our newer players, which is really nice to see. He's been playing as Doriath, of course. He's got some Mount Company of Region here. He's got Marksman, I believe, 3 units of Marksman. Interesting. Seeing people dip more into the red prices to diversify their compositions a little bit is always good to see. Got some Kuthalim, and then a really nice core here of light infantry. So some Wardens of the Girdle, the double fist axes, and they have pretty good damage and decent enough melee defense. But they've also got a limited clutch of poison arrows that they can fire first. And they're going to be shooting into Fingolfin as they move forward. So let's try and move a little bit more quickly through the army comps here. Got Warriors of Region, Donathan Mablung, Shield Bearers of Region, and then I think a second company of Mounted Company who got a little bit too eager and ended up getting blasted for the trouble. And then 2 more companies here of the Warriors of Region. So some really large armies here, which is nice to see. Across the field, we have the Easterlings, another new player here, Y2K. And he's got some Wardens of Lothland. The Easterlings are really scary in this patch in terms of being able to just like grind it out with people. I don't think there's... I think they might be the best faction at just grind fights in the mod currently. I've got some Halberdiers here, and this is another little thing that you may be noticing here. I've changed some of the UI options so that when it says that they're bracing, you actually know what bracing does. We talked a little bit earlier about transparency. That's part of it. So now when they're bracing, if you're a new player, you're like, well, what the hell does bracing mean? It's reflecting a charge bonus from the front. Now you know. Halberdiers here. Move a little bit more quickly through this. Clan Guard. Nice heavy infantry with high melee defense. Got some Warband. Croatani Nomads. Some skirmishers here. Supported by yet more Warband, yet more Halberds. And the Fangs of the Faithless. The legendary company for the Easterlings, who previously had 0 foot archers at all. Now they have these really nice skirmishers. They're shielded. They do trade things off a little bit in that they don't have the same damage. And they don't have cavalry bonuses the way that other Falx-wielding Wolfang units do. And they also don't get the speed bonus that Falxes do. So there is a trade-off here between bringing them and the Despoilers of Dor Caranthir. I think this is what their current name is. And they also don't cause fear, but they do have a morale debuff with their poison arrows from range. So there's a choice still to be made between them and the Despoilers of Dor Caranthir. In behind, got some Salamandrine Guard, a little bit improved. They've got a little bit better in close quarters. So they are, I think, able... I think you're going to want to bring them more and, like, need to be a little bit less worried about, committing them to close quarters. But they do have some really nice bonuses against elephants, but they're also armor-piercing and melee cavalries. Always nice. Over here, Ambarone Honor Guard, a new name for the boar-themed general unit. Still working on replacing some of the officers and generals for Easterlings, so unfortunately, unlike the Haloden and some other factions, they didn't get that this patch, but they will in the next one. Over here, Fingolfin under Morris, who is just smashing into the Easterlings. Blade Masters of Barrett Ithel, taking that bow fire from the front. They do have a passive deflection of 2, so they are going to stand up to that pretty nicely. One of the bonuses of just being Fingolfin. and they're rushing forward, crashing into these lines here. Herdsmen of Lomond leading the way, mixed in with some Bladesmen of Baron Ithel, and the Ulfedin of Ethelbrandir, wow, that was really hard to say, are a little bit hard-pressed here, especially with the inclusion of some pikes here, Sentries of Hithlum. Speaking of pikes, Sentries of Hithlum now lowering their spears here and beginning to charge in support of the Bladesmen Baron Ithel, who are cleaving through the Rigswear. Again, the Rigswear are good at being chaff units and for getting some extra value with their missiles, but when it comes to a straight fight, they're just going to collapse. Dire Warder, however, are made of much sterner stuff, and over here, despite the fact that Fingolfin have some pretty strong numbers, they are slowly down. Part of that has to do with some flanking fire here from the Huskarlar. I'm going to toss those throwing axes down. And one of the things to know about throwing axes is that while not armor piercing, they do have some nice base damage, less throw range, but they are really disruptive. So you'll see some of these units either stagger or get thrown into the air, and that's because they have high mass on their projectiles as well. In behind Fingolfin, we've got some Marines of Vinyamar, Harassment Javelins, really nice unit to have against the Haloden. There's a lot of great picks for them, because they don't have a ton of shield, and they're generally quite lightly armored. Blade Masters of Baron Ithel, they have something to say to these Huskarlar units up here. Their deflection bonus isn't going to be as great against the high base damage of these Huskarlar projectiles. Much higher than arrows, significantly. But the Blade Masters nonetheless will be able to tank a lot of that and get into close quarters. Back here, we've got some Lancers of Anon and Galuth, who've lost about half of their unit. Don't know what happened to them there. They probably ended up charging into the Warder of Brethil. Not something that you want to do with your light Lancers, of course. Big, pointy sticks. Not good for your horsemen. Arqueni Findicano on the field today as well. Armor-piercing archers. Not sure I would have brought them against the Haloden. There are better inclusions, or like better compositions that you'd use them against. Like Angband, for example, is not a bad thing. They can focus fire down the Urloki like you wouldn't believe, and basically be able to do that from a range that Angband can't respond to. So, better choice for them would be to do it that way, but instead they're going to be shooting at the Ulfedin, who are probably the most lightly armored unit around. But I think that that's mostly down to just Morris being one of the newer players as well, and just still being kind of learning the ropes. So, you know, be kind to the comment section. Lancers of Anon and Galuth over here have now rallied, and it looks like they're going to go after dismounted Mardrot. No, they don't actually have a spear on them, so that's probably something that we should do, is put the spear onto their back. Because if you see them on the field, you're going to be like, hey, I can run into these guys. No, you probably don't want to do that. They're actually spearmen. Welsh Rider Dragoons over here as well, moving in against Lancers of Anon and Galuth. And I think Morris is a Reforged player, so there are some units that are Lancers that can actually do pretty decently against Cavalry. The Lancers of Anon and Galuth are not such a unit, and the Welsh Rider Dragoons are going to absolutely slaughter them here. So this is not the engagement that you normally would want to take. Over here, though, things are a little bit quieter. Feanor out on the wings here with the Mounted Company of Kudufin, focus firing down the Urloki, probably not the worst idea. And they're also pretty good in close quarters against the Urloki, but that being said, these units are Harassment Javelins, so I think the Urloki have like 18 or something armor. So even when that's cut in half with a 4 damage projectile, it's still not the most efficient use of your Harassment Javs. There are some better targets, however, such as these units over here. They have like 10 and like 8 armor apiece, so it's actually a really nice pairing. But he's wisely screening his army with these Ironshot Arbalists here, keeping these Mounted Company of Kudufin out of the cookie jar. And really, it's just, yeah, it's going to be down to the Feanor player, I think, to move forward. Angband looks pretty comfortable up there on that hill. And Feanor being played by Buzzard, some Footmen of Amoras, some Stalkers of Thargelion, more Footmen, some Otorn and Mightimo, who I'm happy to tell you will be getting a new model, a brand new unique model, in the next patch. Some more Stalkers, or just a mix here of like Stalkers and Footmen. And then we've got a whole bunch of Edyne over here, some Rangers of Helivorn, Shield Bearers, a whole bunch of them, and then some more Mounted Company over in the back. Not a ton of cavalry on the field from the House of Feanor today, at least not that I can see, which is a little bit surprising, as that's kind of where their strength is. But they've gone a little bit more into the infantry side of things, which is surprising. Usually when people do that, you're going to see the Kinslayers of Alcolande, because they are just such nightmarish, like bloody chaff grinders, especially really good against like Angband. When you can get the right you can get the right engagements, but we're not seeing that today. A little bit more of the Stalkers of Thargelion and things like that, which, you know, might not be the worst. They are armor piercing, and there's a lot of things up here that they can be particularly good at, especially if they're able to flank and get their high charge bonus off, while the Footmen of Amros kind of hold the line and hold things down from the front. And then, of course, there's lots of like shield bearers and other things here. We've got some Hunter Javelins in the form of 2 units of Rangers of Hellborn. Really scary for the Uruloki and the Balrogs if they manage to like get a volley or 2 off into them. They will die off extremely quickly. But yeah, let's go ahead, turn things up a little bit here. This is where a lot of the action is. So Fingolfin has managed to push Stewie off the hill in a few areas here. The Arqueni Findicano, having run out of ammunition, are now being used in rear charges. They're not the best at it. Even Doriath here is struggling to kind of hold the line against Fingolfin, and now with the arrival of some Easterling reinforcements, I think that Doriath is going to be in a lot of trouble, and he doesn't really have an army here that's capable of grinding it out with the Easterlings. Now, there are some things in the face of an Easterling rush that Doriath can do. Javelins are nice. A lot of their throwing axes are also really good because they're so disruptive and they can just generally be very deadly. But also a front line of shield bearers and 2-handed axes can be really, really strong against this kind of build. But it's mostly light infantry here, so Doriath is just getting defeated very handily. There are some shield bearers, and you can see that where the shield bearers are, they're holding on a hell of a lot better. But where the light infantry have to go toe-to-toe with this Easterling grind mob, it's really not going well for them at all. Marksmen here doing their best, but they're kind of unprotected at this point, and being focus fired down here and just cycle charged by Salamandering Guard, which it's not going to do a ton from the front, but, you know, it will hurt. Looks like they're going to be able to get into the flank here of some of these Marksmen of Alcolande, so that will actually make them pay the troll toll. Ravagers of Himring, some Lock Morale Chaff coming in here. The perfect unit for just throwing into the back and letting them disrupt things because they can't route, and there's a lot of them. There goes the Fingolfin General, cut down by what appears to be the Dour Wartha, and I think there's some Sons of Húrin in here as well. Elsewhere, the House of Fingolfin is really, really struggling. Over here, it was just a bloody nightmare for both sides, but that's a lot of dead Noldor on the ground. There are some reserves still to come. Marines of Vinyamar clashing with the Warda, and some Lancers in here as well. There's some supporting units in the back. Marksman of Baron Ithel, so Fingolfin still in the fight. I think some of the dismounted Welsh-Rided Dragoons have been thrown in against them, but they're going to get beaten down by the Marksmen. They are no slouches for sure. I personally wouldn't have moved them this way because now they're just going to get run through. The best thing that you can do is really just like hold your ground against the Welsh Riders in this case. But moving them like this just lets them like basically ignore part of your melee defense. And yeah, he's really paid the troll toll there with like almost 30 men dead, 30 elves. Over here though, Fingolfin has just smashed their way through the Haloden, ground up all that chaff. The Dour Warda not looking so good. In the back, though, Arqueni Findicano getting caught out by the Welsh Riders. They're really not good against melee cavalry. And the Welsh Riders here, even with the presence of the Croatoan Nomads, are going to cut through them like nothing. Salamanders are here as well. And that might be enough to even the odds here. There's a decent amount of Salamanders. And yet more on the way. Yeah, these Welsh Riders are really in for a bad time. Looks like they're going to deny the charge to the Easterling Cavalry, who just kind of moved en masse and just didn't see them here and didn't try to engage them. The Welsh Riders still might get overwhelmed just through sheer numbers and given the fact that they're surrounded, but you know, I honestly think that they'll cut their way through the Croatoan here. And Y2K isn't even seeing it happen, and the Salamanders are moving away, so yeah, not good. Fingolfin's still hanging on by a thread though. Got some Blade Masters over here hacking their way through Huskar Lar and all kinds of other things. And there's still Fingolfin Marksmen. They are being pursued by Ulfedin. There's another company of them over here being pursued by Welsh Riders. I can understand the need to do this, but they're just going to get run down. Like, you probably want to just stand and fight and then try and have your allies send some reinforcements. This is just kind of wasteful. But, you know, newer player, something that you'll learn as time goes on.
Without that general, they may lose heart and flee.
But we've seen a lot about what's going on over there. popping over to this side. Where Feanor, not having the greatest time. There's not a whole lot of things that he has available to him outside of his cavalry, which he doesn't have a whole ton of, to deal with things like the Valaraucar or like the Udaloki in close combat. They're armor piercing, they attack in an area, and the footmen don't have the greatest melee defense, so they will get crushed by these guys. Over here, Stalkers clashing with the Halberdiers. Now, this would normally be a pretty easy fight against those Halberdiers, but the Bulldogs are here and they're going to slaughter those Stalkers. It won't even be fair or funny. Over here, though, is, holding up reasonably well. The Edain providing a anvil, rather, to the hammer of the Feanor cavalry, but they're also in a bad spot. Just being peppered by thralls, maybe even some arbalists and things like that that are nearby. Yes, indeed, they are within bowshot of the arbalists, and they're not actually being cycle charged here. So the halberdiers and scourges and the spear guard are going to have just no problem destroying them. Now in the back, looks like the Rangers of Hellevorn were just not defended. So Tormentors of the Iron Crown were able to get in there along with the Troll Guard of Gothmog, and now these units are basically gone. And that was a big counter to units like this. So if he was able to get one of his Rangers over here and focus fire down the Valaraucar, they would have just been destroyed. That's like nearly 2k right there. Out of the Angband budget, that's been crushed, and a big headache for him to not have to deal with later. So a bit of a mistake there. They also could have been used to focus fire down the Bulldogs. So I'm not sure why he kept them all together like this. I probably would have been a little bit more defensive with this Edain force. Now they're going to begin to break here, being attacked in the rear, being overwhelmed in close quarters. That being said, they did decent enough against some heavily armored Angband troops here. Killed off a good 60 of the Iron Crown Guardians, who are very sturdy, and I think 70 or so of the halberds in close combat. So, pretty impressed by that, but yeah, this was ill-advised and it's just not supported well. And Feanor seems really strung out generally. Yeah, halberdiers here, slowly beginning to get crushed, but the Bulldogs are going to make sure they see it through. Over here, got some Stalkers of Thargelion. I think are getting focus fired down by the Thralls of Angband, although they're now out of ammunition. There goes the Haloden General, however, cut down by the Salamandrine Guard. But yeah, Reavers here with the footmen. It's really just delaying the inevitable. Feanor infantry is pretty sturdy, and they'll hold the line here for a really long time. But once they start to get outflanked and Valaraucar get into the rear of them, it's basically all over but the crying. Well, over here, Haloden getting completely swept from the field. So good news for Feanor and their team at least. The Easterlings are looking real healthy, and they've managed to hold on to some of the Fingolfin reinforcements here as well. Although Martin has something to say about it. These marksmen here, yeah, they're dangerously isolated while a lot of Y2K's reinforcements are just sort of moving off. It's important to try and get in here and save them. There's like a whole unit here that's going to get gobbled up by these warriors that could have been easily routed off by just one unit from the Easterlings. So a little bit of a lack in situational awareness and battlefield awareness there, and it is going to cost them a potentially very valuable unit moving into this late game. So now the Waltz Riders moved in and working in tandem with the Doriath Axemen, and they're basically gone. There's no hope for those marksmen. Even if they were to save them, there's only 11. There's not enough of them. Now the Easterlings see it, and they're going to move around and try and do something about it. But look how easily these warriors are ready to run away. You know what I mean? Cuthalim still in the back, probably trying to take pot shots at salamanders and other such things. But it's all over for Doriath here. The Easterlings and what remains of Fingolfin are ascendant on this side, whereas Angband was not able to be sufficiently damaged, I think, by Feanor. So still a decent shot moving into the late game here, only about 7% or so difference. And all of the important units are intact. So the Valaraucar here, Spear Guard, Bulldogs doing just great, Scourges extremely healthy. If this was all just Iron Shod units, it would be a very different story. Looks like some of the Feanor units will come back from routing, though. So we've got some footmen there. I think these footmen end up coming back from routing as well. There's some Stalkers. Hopefully Buzzard doesn't actually commit them here. I think now would be a really good time to just run away with these Stalkers, but I know that Feanor is going to be able to scrape together a few of their units and throw them in. I know they're trying to javelin what looks like the spear guard. I think this is another one of like the new player things where you're just kind of figuring things out. Where you're coming in from say Reforged or some other mod, and all javelins and all throwing axes are armor piercing, right? There's like very little distinction between them. We do have some pretty fine distinctions. So these are more just like they're really there for a little bit of extra damage against lightly armored, unshielded troops, but they're not armor piercing. So when you're throwing them at like heavily armored troops like the spear guard, you're not really going to get a lot of value out of them. Hopefully the stalkers are able to retreat. I think that would be a real shame if they weren't. Yeah, he really waited too long. There was no reason to try and use them like this when his front line was crumbling. I think that's kind of a waste. But he will be able to save the stalkers ultimately, and a couple of units of Valinor infantry will make it to their allies' lines as well. These footmen, they, however, will not be so lucky. The Valimar are going to be here. They're going to just charge into them.
Our men have captured the enemy.
There goes the Valinor general. That's bad news, Bears. A lot of these troops are pretty tired. Now, they're going to reform, so we're going to get them back. There's going to be at least 2 units of footmen and a reasonably healthy unit of stalkers. But their morale is really going to be quite tenuous, having lost most of their army and their general as well. But I think all is said and done over here. And the Easterlings looking reasonably good. They've got some Amberone Honor Guard, but I would say that Angband is just looking better in terms of what they have remaining. They have all their important units, whereas this is more of a ragtag mix of a couple of different factions, just sort of the leftovers, as it were. Now, there are some decent units. There's some Salamandrine Guard kicking around. I think he's got about 15 or so of them in total, which can be a problem against the monsters. They're quite nicely tuned for fighting Valimar Units and things like that, but yeah, it's going to be a tough one. Marksman here, a few tired Sentries of Hithlum, and some Blade Masters. And then the ragtag remnants of Feanor are going to slowly limp out of the woods. So we're going to turn it up to 1.2 here. I'm going to take a look at chat and see what's going on. Let's see here. Looks like I've missed a lot. 3 marksmen in Cuthalim. It's an interesting build. I forget who he was fighting. Easterlings. I mean, it can be really nice if you're facing down a rush or something and you want to like paralyze a significant part of the enemy army. Then 3 marksmen can be good for that. But they're not really. I don't think they're really worth bringing 3 of them. It's quite expensive. Y2K new player. I mean, he's new to Silmarillion. That's what I mean. Camping opponent. Easterlings are very scary, yes indeed. Got insulted by a developer. Was it me? Did I do it? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Easterling Halberds are disgustingly good, never to be underestimated. That is very true. I think we're going to see that here. So let's go ahead and kick it into 6 times. The remnants of Feanor, the Easterlings and Fingolfin, arraying themselves on this hill. And that is...
Our army is tiring.
That's a frightening Angband force here. So we'll watch them approach through the woods. Still got their Balrogs. Decent amount of Troll Guard there. Enough chaff to keep you busy. The Spear Guard is especially hard to address if you don't have armor piercing, or if you can't outflank them. Thralls are here. I think there's some Arbalists. They might still have ammo. I mean, they have their weapons out, but they could have just been like fighting in melee briefly, and then if they still have ammunition, then they'll pull the crossbow back out, so it's kind of hard to judge. But I know they have been firing a lot, so they might be out of ammunition. 63 Scourges, though. And, well, if the marksmen are able to, like, really train a bead on these guys, then they could eliminate the threat of Scourges of Gothmog entirely. But it depends on what the player uses them for. I believe it's Morris. If he uses them, like, well, and like targets down the Scourges, because that's really the best option here. There's like no other target that you really want to shoot at. Then that could be pretty significant and go a long way for winning this fight for the red team in the long run. But again, newer players, like it's not like an insult or anything. Just you're new, you're learning things, and so when you see if you're used to high damage archers being able to just like cleave through even armored infantry, then you might want to shoot at the halberdiers and just quickly get rid of them. But in this case, there's really no better target than Scourges of Gothmog. Let's go ahead and turn it up just a little bit here. Now, this is an interesting move. So, elephants in Silmarillion can be very, very strong, but if you use them the same way you'd like maybe use Sauron in the Third Age campaign, where he's basically unstoppable, you can just like crush armies with him, then bad things happen. So especially because there's a lot of spearmen here, Ravagers of Himring have bonuses against elephants, and the halberdiers do as well. So if the halberdiers sink their teeth into elephant units like this for any extended period of time, yeah, see, that's what happens. They just die off extremely quickly. Like, you want to be very careful about how you use these units. And in frontal assaults like that, unsupported, yeah, you're going to lose some elephants. But it does, sort of disrupt things a little bit. I think that it's a solid enough tactic, given how this is going to play out. Scourges of Gothmog going to get in there, but the marksmen are shooting at thralls, which is the least of the problems here. They should have been focusing on the Scourges of Gothmog the entire time, and wearing them down and just killing as many of them as possible, because in this big run here, especially with that hill, that's going to give them a little bit of extra range. They probably could have killed off like half the unit or maybe 2/3 of the unit before they even made landfall over here. Arbalists still kicking. It looks like they're trying to flank. Yeah, they're probably out of ammunition if this is the way they're being used. Gonna try and surround these things, but despite the numbers disparity, I think you're gonna be surprised. The Easterlings and the Noldor have the quality here that's just gonna cleave through these thralls. And unsupported, they're just gonna get massacred. Over here, though, looks like the Valimar are down to 1. Oh, there's 2 of them actually. Over here, though, things are a little bit dicier. They are gonna be able to win probably if they're able to just maintain the cohesion of their line and force the orcs to fight the model to model, because that's just where orcs don't do well. Especially as they get more tired and penalties and stuff begin to accrue, then that's where they can start to fall apart. Salamanders in the last place that they want to be, hanging out with the bulldogs. It looks like Feanor just got butchered. There are still some footmen over here, but the fear-causing bulldogs, and the fact that these units are surrounded and outnumbered and losing the fight, yeah, they're going to rout almost immediately. And I don't think that these wardens here are going to be too long for this war, which is a problem, honestly, because the wardens needed to be kept closer to the line. They have a +2 bonus to morale, which is going to be extremely important moving in these late stages when people are tired and fatigue is starting to add up. Like, it really does make a difference. So this is a big mistake here from Y2K. Trying to fight 3 separate battles, basically, instead of, focusing on funneling the Easterlings into the front of your army. And where he is able to do that, you can see the difference, right? So here, they're getting just destroyed, absolutely. Here, despite the number disparity, they are still losing, and they are very quickly thinning out these units. Now, I think there's still Loki hanging out here somewhere. I want to see where they are. Some fire arrows here might just be enough to rout off those iron shot arbalists. This Cav being used the way it is. Oh, well, some thralls routed, came back, but I think that Urloki are still in the field. I just need to know where the heck they are. Yes, there they are. Which is obviously scary, right? But the Easterlings, they can be very, very good in a grind, and there's still some good anti-elephant options for the red team on the field, and that's really what's keeping them in this. These units over here have been routed, unsupported. The thralls are basically just meat, and they're not going to stand for very long. So now the Easterlings are going to be able to sort of reinforce their lines here, more or less at the same time that the Wardens of Alcolande begin to crumble. So we've got some Marksman of Alcolande have managed to get in behind these guys here, but it's a little bit premature because there's still bulldogs lurking in the area, and they're going to be able to outflank them. And now 34 so valuable Marksmen of Alcolande, who are still like good fatigue. They've got really high melee defense. They're actually a very good unit. They're gonna get some destroyed. So Loki charging in here, and you might think that this is basically game over, but actually those halberds in place, and decent enough charge value from the Fangs of the Faithless, plus the early harassment from Feanor. The result is going to be these Urloki actually do not stand up very long. They're probably, of the Angband elephant units, they're probably the least suited to close quarters. They're still pretty good at it, but they're not the Valimar we've seen, fighting very strong consistently throughout this. Some Clan Guard here, managing to get a piece of the Urloki. Urloki will do pretty good against them. Salamanders and stuff, if they can get in there, obviously be a problem. If they get anywhere near the Halberds, they're going to die off real fast. But yeah, you can see the Clan Guard not having a great time here. They're definitely not tooled to fighting an elephant unit. Reinforcements moving in, Clan Guard. It's very, very close. 92 to 96. Marksman of Alcolande laying down the pain with those fire arrows. I don't think it's going to be significant enough, though. I think the Bulldogs are going to be the real big deciding factor here. There's just so many of them, and they haven't really been able to be addressed. They've like fed them with a couple of units and just kept them busy, but really there's not a lot that they can do to focus them down easily without committing to melee, which is where the Bulldogs are going to be at their best. Oh no, Urloki here, trying to charge into the rear. This could be really bad. You can see a massacre would happen. Well, halberds and spears. Let's see what time we're at right now. 11:30. Still reasonable. And there goes the last Urloki. Stepped to the halberdman there along with the spearmen, and they just turned around and eradicated him. Normally they don't die that quickly, but like I said, there was that early harassment from Feanor that we saw with some javelins that probably did a number on them, and the Angband player just sort of left them out there to get picked on. Surround here doing real nice, and some cycle charging from what remains of the Salamanders, but you want to be very careful with them. I would be putting all of my pressure down into here if I possibly could, because this is where all of your best units are and the best chance you have of winning. But we're going to go ahead and just turn it up a little bit here. Take a moment to check the chat. Yeah, not too much going on there. Haven't missed anything. All right, back to it. But this is basically just a grind here. So the Easterlings have done surprisingly well. It's still really close, about 4% difference. And even if they were if there was just a few more of them, or if they had those extra marksmen, for example, and if they didn't commit the other marksmen to a doomed flanking maneuver, this would be way, way different, right? Or could potentially be way, way different. So if you had like 30 or 40 or even as high as 60 marksmen shooting at these guys instead of 10, maybe you'd see a different outcome here. But it's looking like the Easterlings will be slowly overwhelmed despite their tenacity and their resistance. We're going to go ahead and turn it up to 6 times here, and we're going to leave it there. The Valimar are all dead. Everything else, totally dead. And that's going to be the end of it there. The marksmen going to get slaughtered by some tormentors. But all told, it was a pretty interesting game. So you have fights just basically right across the whole map, which is what I love to see. People using all parts of the animal, as it were. Big fight up here in the hill. And it's nice to see that aggression uphill can actually pay dividends. So the Easterlings just bullied Doriath right off the hill. Fingolfin did pretty well against Stewie's Haloden army, but I think that was more of a experience issue. Like, Stewie's been playing for a really long time, and Morris is one of the newer players. At least to Silmarillion. And then over here, yeah, there was a big fight, but it could have gone better, I think, for Feanor if they had used their army a little bit differently and maybe brought a little bit of extra cavalry, because that's where Feanor is at their best, right? There's a couple options here for things they could have brought, like the heavy lancers. Even one heavy lancer can really make a huge difference, especially against Angband, because they hit so hard, they cause big morale shocks, which Angband isn't super suited to dealing with. And yeah, armor piercing, they cause fear, and they can just hit really hard. So when used well, they can like smash parts of the line and just like allow you to create local superiority that sometimes just can't be stopped, and then you just steamroll. But there are, of course, plenty of counters to them. Elephants and fast-moving spears and things like that. Yeah, going back over here, just a tiny handful of leaves from the great host that Morgoth had prepared. And yeah, we're going to be looking at about 4% difference. So a pretty close game here. Again, great to see some new players on the field today. There are, of course, some mistakes, and that's to be expected. It's just something that you learn from. Take a look at, I believe Stewie sent me this replay. So we're going to take a look at how he did here against Fingolfin and later against the Easterlings. Some of the Ulfheden did extremely well, despite the fact that they were nerfed. Obviously, they're still a very strong unit. They were just, too strong. Tharawarda all did really, really nice. One of them only got about 89, which is a little bit disappointing, but, sometimes that's just how it be. Dragoons did really nicely. The Rigswear were just meat, but, they kept the Tharawarda in the fight. Warda Brethil did surprisingly well for the 2 Spearmen. Yep. The one Huskarlar did nicely. They definitely paid off. And the dismounted units did okay. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that so far. I am going to shut down the stream in just a little bit here, because I do have some homework and stuff that I have to do. Got to do some drawing and whatever. But if you guys have any additional questions about Valinor, about the mod, now it's time to ask them. Questions about campaign. I like to have little chats and stuff at the end of the stream, because there's usually a lot of questions that crop up during. So if you guys have any questions about literally anything, just let me know. And I'll leave the stream open for just a few minutes here. Well, it's looking like we don't have too many questions at the end here today, which is totally fine. But again, I'll give it till about 11:40 or so. So another 6 or so minutes. When is the release of the campaign? I get asked that question a lot. I never ever give those sorts of dates, because it's really just setting yourself up for failure and you guys for disappointment. The way that I like to approach things, especially with the team, is that I don't like to force deadlines onto people, because this isn't their job. This is something for fun that they do because they like it and because they're passionate about it, and because I like having them on the team and I value their time and their contribution. I don't give release dates like that. So when we're close to a release is generally when. So by the time that everything is in place and there's really no stopping it is when I will give release dates. But when we're this far away, I just don't. Yeah, it makes promises that we can't necessarily honor, so I don't do it. But I guess I could give a general idea. Maybe, and I make no promises. Maybe about a year or so. That's probably about how long we'll need, based on how long it took us to kind of do things in the last patch. But yeah, can't really promise that. Valinor on the campaign map. Yes, we did talk a little bit about that, and about the ways that Valinor would appear in campaign and in multiplayer and things like that. The summary of that discussion would be they will appear in the War of Wrath campaign, which will be its own thing. It'll have its own campaign map, generally a very focused area in the west of Beleriand. So you're not going to see like Assyrian, for example, in the War of Wrath campaign. And you probably won't see a whole lot of Doriath. But you will see a lot of the Falas and Hithlum and Anfauglith and things like that. And Valinor will be a playable faction in the War of Wrath campaign. However, in the Grand campaign, they are an AI-only faction. And they will appear in the Angband and Tolkien Gauderhoth campaigns as sort of an end boss to your campaign. So that things are consistently difficult throughout the entire experience. The reason that we're doing that and why that's important is because one of my personal pet peeves when it comes to a lot of Total War campaigns is that there is sort of a mid-game ennui where you're like, well, I can see myself snowballing and no one can really stop me, so I'm bored and you just start a new campaign. The intention is for both the War of Wrath campaign but especially the Grand campaign, to be consistently challenging all the way along. So depending on who you're playing, that's going to take different forms, but in the form of the evil factions, that'll be Valinor showing up on your doorstep, and they'll be quite difficult to face, especially as Angband, who's a little bit less quality focused, and the Valinor roster having units that the AI can use very easily, while still being, difficult for players in multiplayer or in the War of Wrath campaign to play. So the AI will be able to use them very simply and very efficiently, and then players will have it be a little bit more complicated for them. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, Valinor will be in the campaign. But depending on which campaign you're playing, you may be able to play as them, or you may have to just face them only. They will also be available in multiplayer, and they'll be balanced for multiplayer as well as campaign play. I think that answers the question. Yeah. All right, we got a couple minutes left. If anybody else has any questions about the Valinor faction, I think we've covered them in length here, but there may be some people who are just arriving. If you have any questions about the mod, or just general questions about, balance, things we want to do in the future, as, the state of things as they stand right now, go ahead and ask. I'll be here for another couple of minutes. Yeah, no worries, Niels. Got another minute or so here. If anybody out there has any additional questions, can literally be just anything. Do you want to know how we balance the mod? How do we decide on, what gets what stats, etc., etc.? I don't mind talking about that too. Will the Valinor units have a high armor stat? It really depends on what you're looking at. So some of the Maiar will, some of the Maiar won't. The Vanyar will be more of a medium infantry unit, so they'll have about 7 or so armor, but they will have an armor upgrade, which can bring it up to 9. The Noldor, however, are the official heavy infantry. So it's the Vanyar, Noldor, and Teleri, and the Maiar. The Noldor will have a base armor of 10, and you can upgrade that to 12 for a fairly cheap armor upgrade, which is pretty strong. But it really depends. So the Teleri units, for example, will all be light infantry, all at about 3 or so armor, and they won't have armor upgrades. So some of the units will, some of the units won't. It will really depend on what they're intended to do and how they're intended to synchronize with the rest of the faction. Let's see. I think we'll probably shut it down there, unless anyone has a quick question that they want to ask. Some things you can expect to see on the channel in the future is a voice acting preview for the Vanyar elves, which was done by myself. I did a bunch of lines yesterday, as I find that when I'm stuffed up and a little bit sick like I am now, my voice has a very particular quality to it, which lends it to being just slightly more sonorous and I guess masculine sounding. So I did a lot of recording yesterday. Most of their lines I wrote. I think that they're probably the ones that we go with. So you can expect to see that in the future. I will have a more cinematic battle or replay, with a highlight reel and all that good stuff, and the silly intros, etc., etc. Hopefully up within the next week or so. And I do want to play a little bit of extra StarCraft as well. And then moving in to much later, I want to play some Diablo Resurrected. Is that their remaster's name? Yeah, I think that's about right. How OP are the Maiar going to be? Because they are gods and not nerfed like the Astari. Ideally, nothing is going to be overpowered. So when we talked about them earlier, there are 2 Maiar bodyguards that will be available for multiplayer, but there will be others for campaign. So I want to try and represent most, if not all, of the Valar in some way in campaign, but without actually adding the Valar. So adding some Maiar servitors and heralds and things like that that represent them conceptually. And I don't want them to be overpowered. That's not really... That's a strange question for me, because it's not something that we really set out to make. We're like, hey, I want to, create this imbalance and make something as broken as possible. Really what we strive to do is more like reasoned and measured implementations of things that can be very strong, but also have some very clear and direct counters, because, it's a mod that's also balanced for multiplayer, but we also want to offer, challenges in campaign, and there's not really much of a challenge if you just have a unit that runs around destroying everything. So the answer to that question is they will be very strong. They will have lots of HP, but they will also be tuned towards being good at certain things and being good at, or being bad at at other certain things. So you will be able to counter them, and not with you won't have to bring 4 units to bear to counter them. You know what I mean? You won't have to be cycle charging them while you pelt them with missiles and surround them with infantry. There will be some very clear-cut, fairly simple ways to counter them, but there are also some very clear circumstances in which they can be extremely powerful, and that's kind of more what we're going for. Spam by the Orc nations. I'm not too sure what you mean by spam. Is that a counter to the Maiar, or can you expect a lot of spam from Orc nations in campaign? I don't know. Just a little bit of clarification there, and I'll give you an answer. If it's the former, the 2 campaigns will handle stack spam a little bit differently, because I think that kind of plays into the whole mid-game ennui that I was talking about earlier, where the only thing you have ahead of you is endless battles that are seemingly meaningless against endless hordes of enemies. Grand Campaign will hopefully not have that be an issue, but the War of Wrath campaign will kind of lean a little bit more heavily into having lots of stacks on the field at the same time, and having big set piece battles, because that's appropriate for the War of Wrath. And it's more of a shorter, focused experience, whereas the Grand Campaign is longer, a little bit more complex, and the choices that you make will have more time to sort of bear fruit and bear consequences. That's something that we want to try to avoid for the Grand Campaign, like I mentioned. But in the War of Wrath, I expect there will be a lot of large stack armies. And you'll be taking, Valinor and some of the other survivors of Noldor, Sindar, etc., into the battlefield to try and crush the forces of Angband, and slowly push and grind your way up towards the Anfauglith and ultimately into Thangorodrim. But in the Grand Campaign, that will hopefully not be the case, and we do have a lot of cool ideas in place in order to limit stack spamming, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's the style of Angband's. Well, they don't really have trash units. They do have decent enough mid tiers that are just individually not super strong, but they rely largely on numbers. But if Angband is just fielding endless armies, then it's not fun. All you're doing is just playing whack-a-mole with stacks, and that's how say Mordor gets treated in Third Age. And I personally find that to be a really boring way to play, and it kind of kills your motivation to continue in the campaign. So Angband will certainly have lots of armies composed of a lot of mid-tier units, large numbers focused armies, but in terms of the raw density of stacks in an area, we're not going to do that. And that's straight up a goal of the campaign, and it has been for a really long time. You will have other things in place. If you're playing as the elves, for example, and you're playing against Angband, there will be systems in place that create a secondary antagonist the more that you destroy Angband. And in this case, I'm referring to the Sons of Feanor. So what we have sort of planned is that you'll take certain settlements, and that will, give you a Silmaril. So they won't all be located in on Morgoth's Crown in Thangorodrim, where you just, attack Thangorodrim and then get all 3. And the reason we're doing that is because as you take more Silmarils from Angband, which will be in very set locations throughout their territory, the Sons of Feanor get more and more hostile to you, and then they build up more. And that may culminate in them getting like an extra script army, not so many that it just gets like spammy and cheesy, but as Angband gets weaker and your campaign sort of seemingly winds down to a close, then Feanor gets stronger, and then they become a secondary antagonist. So that's sort of the end game boss a little bit for the Elven factions, whereas for the Orcs, it's going to be Valinor coming in. Yeah, I've talked a little bit about Glaurung. I do intend to, because I'm in school for game design, and one of the things that we will be doing is like 3D animation, 3D modeling, and things like that. I do intend to make a Glaurung model from scratch, and have him in the mod in some form, whether it be in multiplayer or exclusively in campaign. We also have made the decision to add certain minor factions, some of which will just be like reskins, but they will also maybe have some unique units in them. And one of those is the Brood of Glaurung, to sort of be a early to mid game threat for Finarfin in particular. So they would have like certain things from the Angband roster with like golden reskins, so they have some Ironshod units. They would also have Glaurung as a general, assuming I managed to get him finished, and then they would have some other monsters as well, probably some extra Uruloki, things like that that are all tooled towards being a problem for the specific factions that they're nearby to. So in this case, it's Finarfin. So a lot of Uruloki can be a big problem for Finarfin because they can just bomb them to death. They have a lot of like mid-tier units that generally clock in at about 6 or so armor and things like that, which can be not great defense against a lot of the fire that you can expect from that Glaurung sub-faction. But at the same time, they also have lots of spears and like pikes and so forth, so they do have the means of dealing with them. So that's a fun little dynamic. And then Finarfin will also, I think, be one of the more difficult factions to play because they'll have to deal with Tolin Gaurhoth and the creation of Tolin Gaurhoth, which we have discussed. Having the campaign start at different times if you're playing good or evil. So if you're playing as Finarfin, for example, you'd be fighting around the time of the Dagor Bragollach, when Sauron comes down and takes Tol Sirion and turns into Tolin Gaurhoth, and that's the creation of. So maybe you'd have to start out fighting a big army of orcs led by Sauron in the early game. If you can't take them, then they become the Tolin Gaurhoth faction. But if you can beat them, then you knock Tolin Gaurhoth out of the campaign early, and that makes things a little bit easier for you. But then you still have Glaurung and their brood a little bit later on that you have to deal with, so it's not just a cakewalk from there on out. How will the faction location of Angband be handled? As in, will they be the only be in the north, or will armies of orc be dispersed into the wild? They'll be in the north predominantly, because that's where Angband actually is. They will also have Tolin Gaurhoth, and then we have Nandan Gortheb, which we're intending to create as a faction. I don't know if everyone here has caught the streams and the releases that we've done for Nando and Gortheb, talking about them conceptually. But one of the reasons that I wanted to do that is, again, for the same reason that we'd want to have the Brood of Glaurung, for example. Otherwise, Doriath, so this is going to answer your question there with the whole Melian's Girdle thing, and hopefully touch on Doriath in general in campaign. They're surrounded by more or less friendly factions, with the exception of probably the Sons of Feanor. But then having Nandan Gortheb gives them like an early game antagonist, sort of a goal that they can like work towards overcoming. That is actually quite challenging for them to face. So there's a lot of things that Nandan Gortheb does really well. One of them is skirmish, and the Doriath armies are a little bit more lightly armored, and they have a little bit less shield, and they have more like two-handed units and things like that, which can be vulnerable to large amounts of skirmishers. But they also only have a few ways of dealing with elephant type units, which is mostly in melee, so using the Donathan Mablung, Warriors of Region, and Spearmen and things like that. So Nandan Gortheb is being included not just because it's cool, and because I think it has a place in the multiplayer that will carve out a niche that the orc factions just don't do currently, but it also gives Doriath something they have to fight against early on, that's not just like a cakewalk. So yeah, you're going to see a lot of things like that. And some of the minor factions, like Nandan Gortheb, will be playable in multiplayer, but most of them will just be something that you have to overcome exclusively in campaign, and they won't have their own campaign. They'll just be there to sort of be a problem for you. Million's Girdle. We're working out scripts and stuff like that. I'm not entirely sure how Million's Girdle is going to work, so I have to get back to you on that one. Do I have time to answer more questions? Yeah, if people have more questions, I'm open to answering them. I just didn't want to leave the stream on, for half an hour with nobody saying anything. So if you guys have more questions, I'll give another 5 minutes or so for people to pose them, and then if they don't have any more questions, then we'll shut it down for the day. But yeah, I think we'll give it another 2 or 3 minutes here. And if you guys have questions, then feel free to pose them in the meantime. Transform Osse into a sea dragon? Probably not. I mean, I don't see why Valinor needs that. Also, it's weird. I don't know. I'm not a fan of that idea, and I don't think there'd be any reason to do it other than, it's cool to have dragons and stuff. Elrond and Elros. That's another one of those things that we haven't really decided how we want to handle it, if we end up handling it at all, because Elrond and Elros are just they're just like baggage, right? Like, they're not important in a lot of the great events that take place. Valinor will not be a multiplayer faction. No, it definitely will be. Yep, that's something that we intend. But Elrond and Elros, they're just sort of like kids, right? They don't really do a whole lot. They're more important for Maglor, I believe, and him caring for them and being less of a terrible human being, usually as penance for Dior's children, I believe. So maybe we could work in an ancillary or something, or like a brief choice that you could make in the campaign. But yeah, Elrond and Elros aren't important in the first age, not really. They're more in like the second and then in the third ages and things like that. That's where Elrond becomes important, and Elros, of course, becomes the first king of Numenor. So it's not really a big place for them in the first age. Are we going to add any more factions? Currently, our projected total of factions for playable factions in some form, whether it's multiplayer or campaign, is 14. And the two newest ones, or the ones that you can definitely expect to see next patch for sure, would be Valinor and the Dwarves. And maybe Nanda and Gortheb if we can get around to it. But we will be adding some other minor factions for campaign, just to keep things like difficult and fresh when you're playing in Silmarillion campaign. That usually have some sort of like... It's like a tailored thing. So we talked a little bit about the Brood of Glaurung being like a more or less reskin of certain Angband units with, a small core roster of some unique things, usually monsters, that are generally tooled towards posing a problem for Finarfin. Things like that. Nanda and Gortheb is another such faction that happens to be making it into multiplayer, because I think it can be made interesting and unique. But it's also there to pose a problem for Doriath. So I think you can also expect to see maybe some minor Edain factions with some reskins in them. Just in certain areas. Obviously not for the Haloden, because they're their own separate thing, but you might see like a small minor faction for the House of Beor that has its own like unique reskins and whatever. Maybe for the House of Hador as well. Other things like that. We were talking about maybe an Avari faction down in the sort of southeast of Beleriand, close-ish to the Blue Mountains, but like south of Assyriand. That's something that I've talked about with Finn. This actually answers your question, Giancarlo. That's something that we've talked about, and we were like maybe looking at as well. Other things we have considered, which might be a little bit more controversial, but we do currently have like an undead sort of like meme faction that we've used for like special events and blah blah blah. We have thought a little bit about maybe including them just so the area around the south of Assyriand and like sort of southeast of Doriath isn't just boring and barren, essentially. So we have played a little bit with that, and like maybe adding a little bit more to the undead faction, and just like making them just a little bit more robust, not with the intention of adding them to multiplayer or adding a campaign for them, but just so that there's some sort of threat down there that isn't just elves fighting elves. And the way that we've broken it down is that there's would basically be an equal number, despite the fact that many of our factions in multiplayer are predominantly elven. On campaign, what we're shooting for is an equal number of elven and non-elven factions, so that you don't have to just be, running around kinslaying all the time. Because I know that that's important for some people out there that are like very lore focused. Like they don't want to just play elves and kill other elves. Like they want to be able to have those choices, and I think it's important to be able to give them that. So what that ends up taking place at, or like taking shape as, might be something like using the undead as like a minor faction to sort of spice things up in the area around Assyrian and Doriath and things like that. That might be a little bit controversial because obviously there aren't really undead hordes wandering around in Middle Earth, and there never really have been, except briefly, I suppose, when Aragorn used them to scare some Corsairs out of their ships. But that's the kind of thing that we would look at, and that's the reason that we would do it, not just because, oh, that's fine, undead are neat or whatever. Like, we don't generally... Sometimes we make decisions based on that, but we try to, like, make them somehow related to the story, but also with some sort of gameplay mode in mind. So in the case of that, using the undead for that sort of thing, that would be, like, a pure gameplay decision. Totally divorced from the story, and, like, I'm very much aware of that. I'm sure people are going to tell me that, oh, there's no undead in Middle Earth just wandering around. I'm like, yeah, I know. But that would be the practical purpose behind it. Trying to just keep every area of the map in the Grand Campaign for Beleriand interesting and difficult on multiple different, like, in multiple facets, right? So if you're playing as the orcs, you have certain difficulties that you have to overcome. If you're playing as the elves, you have certain difficulties to overcome. If you're playing as, green elves versus Doriath, there's going to be different things. So Doriath will have Nandan Gortheb. Maybe Assyrian has, the undead or something, and the Avari that they want to, like, absorb into their empire and things like that. And then, of course, they've got the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains who are over there nearby, and, like, maybe they're not going to get along very well. I think that's probably very likely, is that the dwarves and the green elves will be like early game rivals and things like that. And they'll also have to deal with the undead simultaneously. It makes Assyrian a little bit more interesting, a little bit more difficult when you have those two unique but different sets of challenges. So the undead, Assyrian doesn't have a ton of like chaff clearing ability outside of their archers. But they also don't have a lot of like ranged ways to deal with dwarves. So there's two different challenges there in their early game. Things like that. And then for the orc factions, I imagine it'll be a little bit more difficult because there's less things that are friendly or potentially friendly to you, because if there's minor Edain factions, then they're probably going to be aligned with the elves, so you're going to have to deal with them in addition to the other elven factions, in the area. But you will be able to have, little pockets of like evil resistance in the form of the Brood of Glaurung and Tolin Gaurhoth, and then ultimately Angband, moving farther north. There's like that whole belt basically of like things that can be potentially problematic for the elven factions, and also sort of break up that like shield of pure elven anti-Angband sentiment. Maybe for Doriath, a fortress on the border with Beleg Cuthalion. Maybe. That's like a very fine detail that hasn't really been worked out yet. We've got like broad brushes, and like you can see that we have some of the details worked out, but we're not quite at the point where we're thinking about exactly what fortress needs to be put here for what reason, etc., etc. How long has this been? I think it's probably been good, like about 3 hours now. It was a pretty long stream. Yeah. So that's more or less how we want it to be. Gondolin's fall script. That's a possibility as well. I think that would be something that would be necessary for Gondolin at some point, is to have like an Angband army show up on their doorstep, or Angband to... I think the better implementation is for them to have the crusade mechanic where they like decide they want to destroy Gondolin. rather than just having an army appear out of nowhere, because I'm not a big fan of that. I think that's pretty gamey and pretty cheesy. Yeah. So there's a possibility that, that would be necessary for Gondolin to keep the campaign interesting and challenging, is to have, Angband show up, maybe with some, like, spawned scripted armies that, like, spawn far away, and then have, like, a crusade, but they can also, throw crusade armies at you as well. And then it becomes a real struggle to try and hold on to your main capital city. Yeah, I think that's probably pretty likely. Will they give the dwarves special siege weapons and mortars? Yes. Not mortars in the sense of black powder weapons, but mortars in the sense of an artillery piece that uses indirect fire and synergizes really nicely with that dwarven front line. So you can, like, have that front line, have it hold, and then, use that artillery and that indirect fire to pound into enemy lines. But you need to find a reasonable implementation for that as well. Let's see. Did I miss any questions or anything like that? I think we've covered most of them. Yeah, I think we've got them. So if you guys have any more questions here, just as we're winding down a little, I will leave the stream open for another few minutes, and you can go ahead and ask away. In the meantime, I will talk to you a little bit about some community stuff that we have going on, which might be interesting for you. And of course, you can find all the links that you need to our Discord and getting involved and yada yada down in the description of this video. We do currently have a role play going on, sort of like Risk, where we play all the games in the mod, but like there is like a game board, and there's like logistical concerns and building up provinces with recruitment and economic buildings and things like that. So that's something that you can always get involved in. We will be starting up our ELO system, so the competitive multiplayer thing where you have like rating basically, and you like play against other people, and it's like a ladder basically. That's something that we have. We do scenarios and things like that on our Discord. So if you guys are interested in getting involved in the community, I recommend joining our Discord. It's the best place to do it. We also are working on a Wikipedia page to help some of the newer players get in, and also give a little bit of like general fluff for factions and units, but then something a little bit more specific for our more like custom build things. Tolan Gaudhoth is a really good candidate for a lot of that original fluff. Tolan Gaudhoth is just, I made up a lot of the fluff, and I'm pretty proud of it. So yeah, you'll be able to read more about that. Will Gondolin have only one city or multiple cities within their mountains? Gondolin itself, that's a really good question. And it depends on something very specific. So we are looking at making custom siege settlements for Silmarillion. And this will also apply to Angband as well. This is a possibility. Something I would like to see is a series of custom maps that are all sort of located within one city, like conceptually, but that you have to take in sequence. So, for example, Thangorodrim, I would like that to consist of basically 3 settlements, all of which have a unique custom map. The same with Gondolin, so I'd want to have, outside on the fields of... is it Tumladen or Tumhalad? I think it's Tumladen. In the green fields of Tumladen, so you're like trying to take the walls, you're battering your way in, and then there's like a specific area that you need to take. And then from there, you attack the next area, and you're going to have a map that's like the marketplace of Gondolin. And then the final map would be like a citadel, basically. So you're starting, inside of the ruined area that would have previously been the market, and we'll make sure that we like build it based on the previous map, so that there is that continuity. And then there's like another big wall that you have to take, and then there's a new area inside of it. I would like to see something like that be done, so that you can sort of express the grandeur of these big cities and not just try to cram it all into one battle map the way that like Mordor or Barad-dûr and like Goblin Town are. That's something I would like to kind of explore, but it does require us to like learn how to do those things. And luckily we have WK from the Reforged team who is willing to teach us how to do that, or teach me how to do that, and then I'll teach other people how. But yeah, so it's possible that it'll be one city, but I would also, my ideal implementation would be multiple, where you take the walls of Gondolin, then you take the marketplace, and then you take the Tower of the King. And for Thangorodrim, you know, you take the Gates of Angband, then you fight your way through a sort of underground fortress, and then you have something similar where you have like a keep, basically, or like an area around the throne of Morgoth, where you have to fight your way in. That would be my ideal implementation. But, of course, I don't necessarily promise that we'll be able to 100% do that, because it is contingent upon us being able to learn, you know, a lot of new things that we don't currently know how to do. But that's what I really want to work towards, and I think it's important for the mod generally that we have to learn how to do custom settlements. So I think that part at least is inevitable. And then we can look at the implementation of those larger cities. Yeah. Let's see. We're 12:08 here. I'll leave it open for another couple of minutes here. I'll take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll shut her down for the day. No, it doesn't seem like we have too many more questions. I feel bad shutting it down a little bit early. It hasn't quite been 2 minutes, but we'll give it another 30 or so seconds. So if you guys have any other questions, I can take, 1, maybe 2 more, depending on how long they end up being. Will Arendil come? Yes, very likely he will end up as a officer within the Philothrim Legendary Company. I think that's probably the most likely implementation for Arendil. I don't have plans for him to be in Valinor, because I think it's a little bit more appropriate, since we do have a unit that's already named for him, to put him into that unit. So it's likely that he'll end up as a officer in the Philothrim Mariners of Arendil Legendary Company. Yeah. That was a quick one. One more question? No? Alrighty. Well, I think we'll go ahead and we'll shut it down shut it down there. I hope you guys have enjoyed this preview and the discussion surrounding it. I hope it answers a lot of the questions that many people probably have regarding Valinor and how we intend to, I guess, do them justice as a faction within the context of the Middle-earth mythos. So, yeah, hopefully you're satisfied with the answers that we were able to give you today. Coming up in the next little while will be a voice acting preview for the Vanyar, done by myself. And then we'll move into replays. I do have a replay that I want to do for Silmarillion off the new patch. And then I want to play some StarCraft and Diablo and things like that a little bit farther down the line. So yeah, hope you guys have enjoyed this so far, and I will see you all next time. Take care, everybody.